Just welcoming folks, and we'll give a minute or two before we get started, as we hit critical mass with members. Welcome, Nora. Morning, Jill. Morning, Alexis. Saria didn't say hi. Hello.
Morning.
Morning. So it looks like most folks, you'll hear me say this a couple times, just changing your name and affiliation. If you hover over your face square, if that's a word, click on the three ellipses. You can click rename with your organization or individual affiliation. And we'll give maybe another 60 seconds, minute or two before officially launching into the meeting. Wait for a few more of our fellow RAC members to join. Welcome, Lee.
Hi, everybody.
Welcome. Welcome, Morgan. All right, well, why don't we get started? We'll slowly work our way in, and hopefully by the time we do our roll call introduction, we'll have all the folks in the room. So, welcome to the third meeting of the Middle Housing Oregon Homes Rulemaking Advisory Committee. As a reminder, this is a Zoom platform for RAC members who are here live. This meeting is being recorded and live streamed, so for folks that are joining from the public, you're able to observe but not participate in the conversation. For folks that, if it's easy, makes your participation easier, we do have closed captions, excuse me, available. So you can click on the either closed captions button, CC button, or depending on your screen, more, and go to show captions. That helps your participation. We'll ask that folks leave their cameras on as much as possible through the meeting, both for the spirit of building community and also for the audience that's participating online today. As I said earlier, if you haven't already renamed yourself, you can click on the ellipses button. If you hover over your own image and screen, click rename and add your organizational affiliation, or if you're representing yourself as an individual. For chat, we're trying not to use chat for substantive contribution, both for really bringing in conversation in the room, but also our live stream folks will not see chat. So please just use that for technical issues, and we'll make sure that any issues you have, we can help resolve. If we go to the next slide. I'm going to just spend an extra maybe minute on this. I know we've had some really great conversations around this table. And as we get into ongoing kind of substantive and potentially issues that have various perspectives in this room, these meeting guidelines become more and more important to have productive and constructive conversations. So again, we've asked you to honor the agenda. I think folks have demonstrated a real model of coming prepared, so appreciate that. And we've really constructed the agenda very intentionally. Balancing speaking time, there's a lot of perspectives in this room. Every single one of the perspectives in this room is critical to hear from. So we really are asking folks both to kind of come into the conversation, step back, but we do want to hear all the interest-based perspectives in this room, advising DLCD on rules that will work for at the best ways they can. Really asking folks to listen, to learn, and understand. And the other side of that is not listening to respond. So I think particularly as we have conversations that have a lot of different potential alternatives and pathways for rules, really trying to understand the interest-based perspectives of your colleagues around this table. So I'll just emphasize that over and over again, that, it's to the extent that folks have differing or alternative perspectives, that is okay. It's normal and it's expected. And what we'd ask is that you just have a lot of respect to try to listen to why and be curious for how people are bringing perspectives into the room. As you do so, being respectful, being honest, being candid, being constructive, helping to move the work forward, providing ideas and alternatives, addressing issues and questions, not people or organizations, right? Operating in good faith, assuming others are doing so as well. To the extent that we can find common ground, that is wonderful. And it's a gift to DLCD, where differences are resolved, where you all strategize together to come up with alternatives or solutions that can work across multiple perspectives. And then finally, just really naming things as early as possible, right? So if there's things that are coming up for you, bringing it into the room, shining some light on your perspective, ideas, concerns, and thoughts. So I'll just ask again that folks really hold this as we have this conversation today. It's ripe for multiple perspectives to show up. If we go to the next slide. Our hope today is kind of two outcomes and really structured purpose. One is to provide input on tree standards, the land use review processes, and Ethan will talk a bit about this kind of pivot to this kind of unique space for conversation on the updated definition for the cottage cluster, to adapt to some new statutory language captured in HB 2138. In order to do that, if you go to the next slide, our agenda will move through some of our housekeeping and logistics. We'll remind you and reground our collective selves on the racial equity framework and how we think about equity, going back to our first conversation where you all did a really good job of naming some of the potential impacts, concerns, and considerations to hold with the equity framework. We will create, as we will in every meeting, a bit of space for folks to reflect back on the previous meeting. So in this case, meeting 2, if there's other things that have come up, thoughts and other issues you'd like to raise going backwards before we move forward, we'll create a little bit of space for that. And then we'll move into a few different conversations. So one, just solidifying the scope. We've had a lot of conversations in this room around getting the scope clarity. Hopefully the materials that have been provided, a little bit of space today will help kind of level set us all, so we don't continue to have a clarification conversation, but can really move into the substance of discussion around the rulemaking scope that we have. And then we'll spend some time on tree standards. Hopefully folks have had a chance to kind of do the pre-work, understand kind of the scope and conversation we're hoping to have. We'll discuss the local review processes and where kind of local review makes sense within the context of these rules. We'll build in a break, and then we'll close our meeting with a conversation around cottage clusters, the definition, and some of the opportunities to shape that discussion. Finally, we'll close, talk about next steps, and get you out of here by noon. So with all that said, quickly and moving through it, we're going to move into introductions. So it says introduction, but really it's a roll call. So I'll just ask you to say if you're here, and I'll go in alphabetical order, still starting from A. So Alexandra, you'll be first.
Hi folks, I'm looking at the right camera. I'm having camera issues this morning and I just turned it on and it is the wrong camera. I'm Alexandra Ring. I'm the Housing and Land Use Lobbyist for the League of Oregon Cities.
Great, thank you. Andy Bolton.
I am Andy Bolton. I am the Acting Manager of Policy and Technical Services for the Building Codes Division.
All right. Annika, are you here, Annika? Brandon, I saw you, Brandon.
Good morning, everyone. Brandon Persinger with the Association of Oregon Counties. I cover natural resources and land use related issues for Oregon's 36 counties.
Thank you. Brock.
Hey everyone, Brock Nation Policy Director at Oregon Realtors.
Thank you. Kathy.
Catherine Rigby. I'm serving as an individual.
Thank you. Cheryl?
Good morning, everybody. I'm Cheryl Bell, and I am one of the Assistant Directors of the Department of Transportation and Development for Clackamas County.
Thank you. I know Dustin's not going to be here. Diego?
Hello, Diego Diaz, Fellowship for Equitable Development with the National Community Reinvestment Coalition and Housing Oregon.
Thank you. Eric? Yep, there you are, Eric.
Good morning, Eric Rutledge, City of Sherwood.
Thank you. Elsa? Did I see Elsa? I think so. Fred?
Morning, Fred Evander, City of Independence.
Thank you. Jerica?
Jerica Ferguson, just an individual.
Thank you. Jill?
I'm Jill Kropp from Studio Kropp Architecture. I work with developers on infill housing in Portland and the metro area.
Thank you. I don't think I saw Jim. Jerry?
Yes, I'm here.
Oh, Jim, you are there. Sorry.
No
You can
problem.
jump in and then I'll come back to you, Jerry.
Jim Taylor, Disaster Recovery at Oregon Housing, building homes for wildfire survivors.
Thanks, Jerry. You're catching me in my bad eyes trying to track this. Jerry, jump in.
Yeah, Jerry Lids, individual from Eugene and former LCDC commissioner.
Thank you. Jonathan? Can I see Jonathan? Okay. Lee?
Lee from Habitat in Portland.
Thank you. Mary Kyle?
Mary Kyle McCurdy with 1000 Friends of Oregon.
Thank you. Mark Taylor? Okay. Morgan, thought I saw you earlier. Yep.
Tracy Morgan, famous comedian and actor. April Fools.
Hey, there we go.
Morgan Tracy, City of Portland.
You're making me sweat a little bit. I was like, God, I'm really messing up today. I was calling you Morgan. I could have sworn. Nora? Is he Nora?
Good morning. I'm Nora Cronin, the Director of Real Estate Development at Dev Northwest. We develop affordable rental housing and affordable homeownership opportunities throughout the Willamette Valley.
Thank you. Shane?
Morgan, I like you more every single meeting, so thank you for that. Shane Kwiatkowski, permacultural landscape architect and trans feminine housing advocate in the city of Portland.
Thank you, Shane. Sarah? You see Sarah? And then Samantha. Okay, then Chair, did I see Chair Lazo today? Yeah, okay, so I won't put him on the spot. Did I miss any RAC members? Okay, and then Becky, normally I would ask DLCD to just jump in when you contribute, but I want to welcome you back in. So if you could say hello to the group, talk a little bit about your role, that'd be great.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Becky Catino. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a housing planner with DLCD in the housing division, and I was out on paternity leave, so I excuse myself to go get some coffee. That may be why I have a newborn right now, but I just wanted to take the time to thank everyone for your participation, and it's really invaluable as we start to move into actual rule writing of this process. So again, thank you for your input and really looking forward to the conversation today.
Okay, thank you, Becky. Let's keep moving. So as a reminder, this RAC process is connected and has the opportunity to really embed the racial equity framework for decision making in its advisory role to DLCD. And so what that looks like is kind of the reflection on historical inequities, benefits and burdens, thinking about data that guides the analysis and rulemaking, how community voice and meaningful involvement can inform ultimately rules and resulting in and seeking out outcomes for restorative justice, creating accountability, and having measurable outcomes and ongoing improvement that benefits Oregonians. If you go to the next slide, just a quick reminder of where this group reflected back in its first conversation. And so just spending a moment to reground yourself to hold these analysis. So when you think about inequities historically, just acknowledging that many communities have been excluded from housing access, and that the barriers that exist within housing systems have impacted development and costs. The other thing you all named is NIMBYism, not in my backyard, that shows up at a community level, and something that we're collectively working to overcome. Thinking about the distribution of benefits and burdens, acknowledging that increasing housing production can reduce costs and improve access for communities, and that siting and design has impacts. And can have positive impacts on community safety and community well-being. And that's, obviously big, broad umbrella of what well-being can look like. And you all have given some great examples. To think about data equity, data justice, we know, right, in the data, and you all articulated, that communities of color, communities with disabilities, LGBTQ plus communities are disproportionately housing insecure, disproportionately ... right, on a number of different outcomes. And finally, that community has identified needs, and you all reflected a lot of this around multifamily housing, around accessibility and fair housing, around community and cooperative models, around kind of livability as it relates to the housing we create in Oregon. So again, just spending a moment to reground ourselves as you all have this conversation, to think about the equity framework as we move through the discussion. Let's keep moving. So as I said earlier, we create some space. We can go to the next slide. Create some space to kind of look back before we continue forward. And so some of what you all hopefully saw in the meeting summary, but just want to lift up here, and then I want to open it up if there's further thoughts or reflections, comments from the last meeting. So one, just reconciling this reality that there felt to be a lot of confusion about the rulemaking scope. And so I hope that the work that's been done, we'll spend a little bit of space today, kind of reminding folks of that scope, regrounding ourselves in that scope, so it doesn't kind of capture our conversation going forward, and we can really hone in on the rulemaking conversation that we are meant to have. That there was a lot of discussion around design standard considerations, particularly that they should be simple, they could lean towards efficient development. We talked a lot about setbacks and height and parking, access, landscaping, right? Thinking about the front facade, glazing, wildfire risk management, a lot of different considerations that you all brought up, designs that allow for flexibility, and ultimately to get to that goal to successfully site units. We had a conversation around design variance and adjustment considerations, again, around these themes of flexibility that supports development while also managing for safety and avoiding the significant increase of cost, and conversations around the relationship with easements, accessory structures, landscaping considerations, et cetera. And then finally, as you all aptly point out, right, there's some overlay and connection with other policy at the state, including kind of climate-friendly equity community standards, the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis, Residential Model Code, SB 5037 mandatory adjustments, and R327 fire standards. So as we have these conversations, you all have continually reminded us, right, that it's not happening just in isolation, but some overlap with other stuff. So with all that said, as a point of reflection, I would love to just open it up if there's other thoughts that came up, other reflections from our last meeting that can kind of help us kind of clarify the past while we move into today's conversation. Yeah, Shane, please, and then Morgan.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So I'm just feeling a little bit nervous this morning. I think yesterday with Transgender Day of Visibility and everything that's happening to the transgender community in the world, my voice is going to warble today because I am so grateful to be in this space. I am so grateful that I was viewed as an expert by the people that invited me here. And I am deeply grateful for all the expertise that I learned from other people. But I must be forward. Last meeting, the following week, I deeply wondered if I should leave this group because, and I'm trying to really measure my words, I felt interrupted, I felt discounted, and I felt that because I'm not a builder, because I'm not an architect, at least not of buildings, simply landscapes that spill forth flowers as oceans spill sea anemones. I'm not a builder of houses, but I'm a builder of community. I don't work in civic government because I'm planning for a future where government is irrelevant because it will die. That is the reality of being trans feminine in today's America. But let me say something specifically. I was trying to make a recommendation for landscaping last meeting, and unfortunately I felt that I was kind of interrupted. So I'm going to go ahead and finish my thought. I wanted to talk about hugelkultur beds and make a recommendation to the state that we research hugelkultural permacultural design and implementing that within site building designs. The reason I say this is this. In the last 6 months, I have turned over 1,000 square foot of fallow land, and I have moved over 3,000 pounds of clay soil, 2,000 pounds of branches. I processed all of them from the windstorms, and I put them in the ground. And from November to now, I've planted individually over 600 unique plants and bulbs. Where there was nothing, there is something. And it cost me less than $300. There will be more life. And I have made more community in the last 2 weeks of happily gardening in my trans feminine outfit and saying hello to the baby children and the sweet baby animals than I have in an entire 36 years of living in a suburban area that is filled with more people who support Trump than they believe trans feminine people exist. I have had to decolonize and realize that our imaginations have atrophied and our hearts have shrunken, like the Grinch, who is the world is a city of Whovilles, and we are trying to fight to survive and love. I am saying this because hugelkultur has also been utilized as a wildfire mitigation technique. And if we utilized all trees that fell and all debris that fell and had all debris, yard debris in Oregon, not diverted to landfill, but made into hugelkultural beds throughout all cities and throughout all rural municipal regions, we would save water, we would increase soil arability, we would increase biodiversity, we would increase beauty. So going forward, I am not an expert in certain things, but I am a prodigy in others. So as I receive others in expertise, I invite everyone else to receive my expertise with respect and without interruption. And I really appreciate your time.
Yeah, thank you, Sharon. And just a couple things. One, I think, I had to look up so I knew how to say and spell hugelkultur. So one, I think that will weave into the conversation that we'll have, later in this agenda around how do we think about trees and mitigation and alternatives for kind of what do we do, right? In that setting. The other thing that I just want to just appreciate in this moment, right, is the courage that it takes to talk about impact. Right. And to remind this group kind of where we started today around listening to each other with curiosity and to try to understand perspective. So it's a good kind of example of you kind of giving this gift to the group to remind us to hold those group agreements, but also to listen to and appreciate the expertise that looks and feels different around this room, but is equally important. So thank you for bringing that into the space. Morgan, please jump in.
Thanks for sharing, Shane. That was great. I think I'm just going to reflect on it real quickly. Like trying to translate as a practitioner, I think that what that means for us is understanding the importance of the lived experience in these homes that we're trying to see produced, and what that means translating into standards is creating space for community to interact. So that sort of front quasi-public space, the open space, those are, I mean, if we're going to try to translate hugelkultur into zoning requirements, that's kind of I'm trying to make that translation. So anyways, I wondered if this was the moment we're talking about the scope clarification, or is that a separate topic?
Yeah, Ethan, you want to jump in? Because we do have a space on the agenda for that.
Okay.
We got a chunk there, but I would love, I mean, this is the time for, further thoughts on that. We can carry those.
But do you want to preview it, Morgan? Oh, you went back on mute.
I had a chance to read the statement, which was helpful. And I think my understanding now is that it's both the BCD plans and private builder plans of middle housing up through 11 unit apartment buildings or multi-dwelling buildings. And that, I think that's helpful. There was a new term that was introduced in the statement, so I just want to get some clarification around that. It referred to Oregon Homes lot plans, and I don't know what that is. And I think that might be a product of what we're trying to accomplish here, but unfortunately, the clarification led to a little more confusion on that aspect.
Yeah, Ethan, I don't know if you want to answer now or just hold the
Yeah.
question and just
Hold the
let's wrap this part of the agenda, because that is the next discussion. So Morgan, thanks for bringing it in, and I'm sure if you're wondering, there was probably others as well. Any other reflections back on meeting two, either some of the themes or anything that's come up for you since the last meeting? Okay. Not seeing any hands raised. Ethan, you want to move into then the solidifying scope
Sure.
conversation? Maybe if you want to offer some comments and then start with Morgan's question, and then we can open it up for any other questions that folks might have.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. Hi, everyone. My name is Ethan Stuckmeyer, manage the housing division at DLCD. It should have been seek to solidify scope, and because I think this is a thing that we're going to continue to work on, find the bounds of. I'm not going to be able to fully articulate every single instance where we're out of scope, but I also commit to being jumping into this meeting in particular, saying we really feel like that comment that you're making here is out of scope of this rulemaking, and helping you and us collectively figure out a space where that conversation can be had if it is not in here. So just a little caveat to the word solidifying that I'm going to attempt to do. And then also wanted to share and this is a good transition from the reflection of meeting two into this piece, which is that this part of the process, this part of the rulemaking process is really to be a sponge, a collection funnel of the concepts, the ideas, the perspectives, the things that folks are raising in this meeting are, from DLCD's perspective, viewed as important to the development of the program. So the things that are shared here are really, we're at that stage of collect it all, try to sort through, try to identify the pieces that are going to make it into the policy. Not all of them are going to make it into the final proposed set of rules. We're just not at that point of this process yet, where we're drafting rules or can share a set of rules with you. We are getting close to that, but we are hoping to get into those real deep, how does the actual rule text work and how are my points and perspectives being represented in those rules. So I just wanted to share that as well. So to the scope, I think one of the primary pieces, if I could try to distill it down to this big question about scope, is, are we talking about the building or are we not talking about the building? And really in the DLCD scope of the rulemaking, we are only talking about the where and the in what instances do buildings, Oregon homes, get built. We are not talking about how the buildings are built, what is necessarily in the building. We're not talking about whether we're building 3-bedroom units or, how many bathrooms, how many kitchens, whether it has slab on grade or anything like that. That is out of scope of this rulemaking. When we are talking about, and I think one of the clarifying pieces that I'd like to make here is, last meeting we talked about design standards and siting standards, and I realize that word design triggers a lot of different things for the folks in this room. We have architects in this room. We have other folks in this room who are thinking about design from a perspective that are about the aesthetics and the some of those more truly designy kind of things. And I think when we're thinking about the regulations from a land use and building perspective, those design standards are really, I can consolidate design standards and siting standards into what are typically known in a practitioner, from a local government practitioner perspective, as development standards. Well, that's really what we're talking about here. We're not talking about the how we're structuring, whether it has a gabled roof or if it has a single slope roof, or like what color the siding of the building is. We're not talking about design in that context. We're talking about whether or not it has, like, how big is the front yard. That's those are the kinds of development standards that we're talking about in this rulemaking scope. So I wanted to just kind of offer those clarifications, and also invite Andy, if you would like to share anything. I didn't prep you for that request, but in your packet, in the RAC members packet, is a clarification memo that Building Codes Division provided on the building plans. So the differences between permit ready plans and the plans that Building Codes Division themselves will be creating with the help of architecture and engineering folks. And then there's the master plan portion of that. And then even on top of that, there are locally adopted plans. And all of those things are related to the actual building itself, which are distinctly out of scope of this conversation within the DLCD rulemaking. But Andy, if you wanted to add anything into that conversation, feel free.
The only thing really quick, and I think this goes to Morgan's question, I think he was referring to that document that I put together. The phrase Oregon Homes lot plan, that was just my phrase. It is not an official phrase. I was literally just trying to designate like the plans that are going to come out of this rulemaking, those type of plans. I was trying to delineate them from building plans. And that was the phrase I was using, but it is not anything more specific or term of artish than that.
Not a defined term, a way to articulate the results of this rulemaking, of DLCD's rulemaking.
Does that clarify, Morgan?
Yeah, that helps. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, Jill?
Hi, so when you say development standards, in my mind, that includes things like height and floor area. But is that scope included in your mind?
Yeah, right. So
Okay.
what might be the maximum building height, to draw on your example of a building that is approved? There's going to be a metric by which a local government assesses compliance to the Oregon Homes program to approve that building. That might include a standard that building is not taller than 40 feet, 35 feet, or something like that. But it would not, let me see if I can clarify a little further. It would not, within the scope of this rulemaking, would not be how tall does that building need to be to accommodate 2 stories and a mezzanine, or 3 stories. That is not part of the scope. That is a determination that's made on the building itself, not the approval of the development. Thanks.
That makes sense. Well, maybe for those of us who don't write policy, who are more practitioners, like if we give feedback in one of these meetings and it's not applicable, maybe you all can just sort of take that in and then use it to how you need it, and maybe not worry so much if we happen to suggest something that's out of scope. Yes, that'd be my suggestion.
Totally agree, Jill. And I'll also attempt to say, or jump in those instances where we are kind of moving out of the scope, window, and say, yeah, this is really feeling like something that we're not going to be able to address here as part of the House Bill 2258 scope of rulemaking.
Yeah, that's great, Ethan. I was going to say, let's find the balance between capturing and not dismissing things that might be out of scope, while also not going down a path of conversation out of scope, continuing that space. So that's helpful. Let's go. Eric, Kathy, Fred, Cheryl.
Thanks, Ben. I guess my only comment or recommendation is to, I guess, advise us on how to either track the other type of, if there's rulemaking or just decision making at BCD, or a process that's being set up there. Like, let us know how to track that, how to get communication. And I don't know if you can answer it here or through a memo, but I guess, for Sherwood anyways, planning and building, we work so closely together. I think that's why we're kind of like, hey, let's just talk about it all right now. We're always in meetings together, flushing this stuff out. So it's a little I don't know, different for us to be so separate. So, you know, I would love to be able to go down and talk to my building official and let him know how to track this from the building code side. So just letting us know how to be involved in that process, I think would help kind of demystify kind of this scope versus the other. And then I guess just wanted to express my concern again about that process, even though it's separate from this rulemaking, of placing too much burden on the local governments to lift this and stand this program up, when it should be a state program. I guess unless there's going to be funding or plan review, like, are you going to, you know, provide a plan review fee to the local governments that are helping do this plan review on behalf of the specific jurisdiction or region? Like, you know, we're fee based, and so just placing that, you know, burden on the building official to do a courtesy review to stand up a state program doesn't seem quite fair to me. So there either needs to be funding, or building codes division needs to, you know, do the regional reviews themselves. Thanks.
I don't know if there's a response there, or just capture that as input, as a risk factor, because you're fee based, you're losing those you're kind of doing it on behalf of the state. Thanks for naming that. So I'll just leave that as a comment for now and then ask. Kathy?
Yeah, so my comment is, and I realize that anything inside of the building is out of scope, but when it comes to our conversation later about the clusters and their location on a lot, you mentioned fire standards, but also ADA standards were not referenced. And so we're not talking about, when I mention it, I'm not talking about design inside, or whether it fits a person, but access from, say, parking or street to where you locate front doors. So just to bring attention to make sure that those things are incorporated with any type of lot design or layout of buildings.
Yeah, so do you want to just provide clarity, right? Like, so how, like, accessibility and ADA access would be considered in that conversation, just so we're prepping for that discussion?
So yeah, thanks. I just want to, this will be a difficult one for this meeting in particular, because I want to really just be clear that the first two parts of the agenda, the tree removal and the local reviews, are related to House Bill 2258, the Oregon Homes Program. The cottage cluster portion of this meeting is about a different bill entirely. And I apologize for the proximity of that, but we're going to have to do our best to try to separate our minds to think about a different program entirely throughout the course of this meeting. But Kathy, to your point, the question of the definition of cottage cluster for the purpose of that conversation, one of the considerations that we're looking into is small footprint and floor area. And one of those considerations, I think, that we should definitely consider is, how small is small, and such that it would be, prohibitive for, appropriate ADA accessibility, standards. That seems like one of the operational, kind of functional considerations to make in, helping us craft what that definitional structure actually looks like. So I encourage you to bring it up in that conversation. We can consider it as part of that development.
That's great. And I think, Jill, to your comments earlier, Kathy, naming something, even if it doesn't directly relate in this moment, is still valuable information to put into the record and to advise DLCD around. Fred, then Cheryl.
Yeah, so my question's just a quick one. So I guess I'm still not clear on the distinction between design standards versus development standards. And I'm curious specifically, like, are things like glazing on the front of a house a design standard or a development standard? I guess I'm also curious about things like the width of a garage across the frontage, again, a design standard or a development standard.
Yeah, good question. So on the garage one, that would be about the approval of the building, the approval of the development at the local government level. If there is a standard, if at the end of this process, there are standards related to driveways, garages, so on and so forth, the criteria to meet those standards would be in the scope of this rulemaking. So like you could think of this kind of checklist approach. If there's a development that's on the table for review at the local government level, and they're looking at all of the standards for Oregon homes, and that's one of those standards, if that's how this rulemaking ends up, then the local government, not the building official, not the building part of that review, but the local review for compliance with the development standards, then that would be something that we'd be talking about as part of this Oregon Homes rulemaking project. For window glazing, again, I think that's one where the actual, like what kinds of structural elements that might be part of the glazing or any openings or anything like that, not in scope, but considerations about how approving the actual development itself and whether or not that building has windows on the front facade, I think is within the scope when we're talking about design standards for development of an Oregon home. I'm really trying to draw that line between, any development that comes in to the city using the Oregon Homes program instead of a specific development that is pre-approved at the Building Codes Division. Am I hitting that target?
I don't know. I guess it's still not, I don't think I still quite understand. So I mean, what I'm hearing you say is that we're not talking about the amount of glazing on the front of a house. Is that correct?
Right. I would say yes. I'll just put yes as an answer to that. Correct.
Okay.
Thanks, Fred. Cheryl, then Morgan.
Thanks for having this conversation, and I really appreciate the BCD memo. That was super helpful. I think that's where my clarification question comes from. From the memo, it appears, I want to make sure I have this correct, that the structures that could be placed under the Oregon home sites are the ready-made plans from the state, a master plan from the state, or any other structure that's permitted locally. So really, it's like all housing types. So then if you go back to the definitions in the bill, then really it starts with the lot and making sure that the lot meets the definitions of the bill based on size, vacancy, those kind of things. I guess the reason I'm seeking clarity is originally when we all were convening, we were talking about, should these design standards, things like setbacks and that, be attached to the structures themselves or the lot? And it seems like if any housing type is allowed on these Oregon homes, it's really almost like I'm putting a banner over a lot after we've done that analysis and said, okay, this lot meets the Oregon homes criteria, and then only certain types of structures that meet the legislation can go on that lot. But then it's kind of under the Oregon homes banner, and it is going to be different than the lot next door. I think it would help me understand when we look at the design criteria or we have this conversation with trees to make sure I'm understanding. It makes me lean more towards the requirements going on the lot, not the structure, since any structure could be allowed. So that was the clarity I was seeking.
Yeah, I think hopefully that was helpful to others. The only thing I would add to your comment there, Cheryl, is that the being deemed or eligible for Oregon homes development, a lot being eligible for that, does not preclude any other kind of residential development. It's not like, okay, this has been identified an Oregon lot, you can only build an Oregon home. That's not the case. So I just wanted to make that point also clear.
Okay, that's helpful. Yeah, because I guess I was assuming like if it made that, if in the for jurisdictional folks and actually probably for developers, some kind of flowcharts or spreadsheets might be helpful because it goes through the first piece and you have to like check all these things to see if it meets the legislation. If it doesn't, you still probably have an opportunity to build on the lot, but it's going to be under a different thing. So the legislation gets very specific. It would be helpful.
Good.
Yeah, thanks for the clarity. This was really helpful.
Thanks, Cheryl. Morgan, did your hand come down or are you still in the queue?
Well, yeah, I think I got my answer. I just wanted to put in a plug for BCD since just we brought up accessibility, and I know I'm not talking about things inside the structure, but there are bonuses that are tied to middle housing with accessibility features. And so while we're developing those sort of ready-made plans, just putting in a little plug for that. It'd be great to have a model that people could follow.
Good. Thank you, Morgan. Okay. Not taking any hands. I'm going to seize the opportunity to move on. So let's go, if we want to pull back slides, let's move into our first conversation around tree standards. Ethan, you want to give a little bit of context and then we'll move into discussion?
All right. Yes. Thanks, Ben. And we will, I'm sure, find ourselves with those same kind of questions throughout the rest of this. So we can address those when we get to those. For trees. Okay. So one of the elements in terms of the scope of DLCD's rulemaking, and I should have said this in the last piece, the section 2 of the bill, subsection 5, subsections A through E represent the scope of rulemaking. So if you're ever curious, those are places to go look. The tree removal and mitigation kind of authority for DLCD and LCDC to adopt rules is what we're talking about here today. So I would like to kind of set up that conversation by, I think this was helpful for DLCD as we were kind of crafting the presentation and preparing for today, identifying tree removal standards in the context of Oregon homes as kind of levels of protection. So as articulated in the bill, one of the first levels, or I'm not even going to like tier them, it's just a level of protection is in fact a prohibition on removal. That is those kinds of trees that are heritage and greater than 20 inches diameter at breast height are prohibited from removal in the Oregon homes development process. I use the term variance from those prohibitions in the presentation. I actually want to correct that to use the word deviation, because I know variance, capital V, variance means things. I was really talking about deviation from those prohibitions is not considered, or we're not considering deviating from those prohibitions that are already articulated in statute. Another level of protection that's articulated in the bill are trees that can be removed, but mitigation, replanting, replacement are required, or mitigation of those substantial trees, but not those ones that are prohibited. Mitigation of those removals are, part of this rulemaking conversation. Not part of this rulemaking conversation, out of scope, is the third of 3 tiers, which is trees that can be removed without mitigation, without replanting, without replacement. And those are trees that are not listed in the first 2 levels. So I wanted to identify those kind of levels of protection that are articulated in the bill, things that are out of scope. And really the conversation today will be focused on what are the things that a builder might do to mitigate in that kind of second level of protections, those trees that can be removed as part of Oregon homes development, but must be replanted, replaced. So that's really keying in on those pieces of the regulatory framework is what we're here to talk about today. So that's my cue out, Ben. We have some discussion questions, things like what information might be necessary for the builder to provide to the city to review those mitigation plans, what kind of menu of options, and I think that's really what we're talking about here, a menu of mitigation options, not prescribing any particular mitigation measure or replanting or replacement measure, but crafting this kind of suite of mitigating efforts that can be chosen by an applicant or in coordination with the city.
Good. So we can, Shane, I see your hand before I go there. Chair Lazo, I saw you join. Can I introduce you or have you introduce yourself, I guess? Say hello.
Yeah, thanks. Good morning, all. I was actually didn't have the link, and so I was over on the YouTube channel, just hanging out and watching you all. So I'm glad to be here this morning, and appreciate this discussion about the details of getting the program rolling. So thank you all. Good morning.
Yeah, welcome, Chair. Thanks. So just as a reminder, Ariel, do you want to bring up just the discussion questions? We'll flash those. I know Ethan just said them out loud, but we'll put them on the screen. And then Shane, let's start with you.
I guess this is more of a clarification question for me. This may not be answered in this meeting, so it's kind of a request for if someone could maybe message or email me more specifics about this, because unfortunately I just didn't get the message prior to this meeting about the tree standards. So I was like, I just didn't know what was happening. So I don't know, are these tree standards in the thing that we're analyzing now, is it connected to certain kinds of standards or laws that require the certain kinds of plants or trees that would be replaced?
Shane, probably not the, some local governments do designate which species of trees need to be replanted,
Okay.
or what that replanting looks like.
Excellent. So just in case if there's any confusion or if there's patchy holes, I would definitely make a recommendation to the DLCD. I don't know if it's going to be incorporated or not, but really incorporate, if you are going to be requiring that a tree is recited, I would really request, there's at least 200 plant species, like shrubs to large shrub trees to trees that could be done well. And depending on, product location and pricing, I think giving a huge list that's just cross-indexed to that design standard. So people are like, okay, well, I have to put a tree. What can I do? And then if they know that this is the whole slew they have available, then they're not limited to just one thing. Or horrors of horrors, they may plant a crab apple. I don't know. So.
Right. Thanks, Shane. So let's open up the conversation. You see the discussion questions. So really, and again, to Ethan's point, there's kind of, you can remove, and you can remove, but you got to mitigate. And we're going to focus in on that middle space. So let's start with Brock, and then we'll go to Jonathan.
Thanks, Ben. So one, I just want to remind us that, the first thing that we're trying to do here is make sure that we can get some of these homes built, right? So let's keep process to a minimum to the greatest degree possible, as long as it's clear. With that said, replacement, I think, should only be required under this program when it meets those 3 criteria in statute under big B. We don't need to have replacement if it's not one of the statute doesn't tell us that we have to, and if we do, that's probably just making the process harder. Replacement is great to be encouraged and incentivized, but if it's not required to be replaced, what's not required in the rule? The other thing I would say is that let's make sure that when we're doing replacement or replanting, that the tree, both in terms of species and location, you kind of have to consider the two together, isn't going to damage underlying infrastructure. For example, I know a homeowner who had their curb inspected as part of a routine kind of maintenance thing by the city. The city came back and said, hey, by the way, you don't have a tree on this side. It was on the corner of a block, and you need to put a tree here. And the property owner was very frustrated because putting a tree there with the kind of roots for the trees that are in the area would go through and it would damage the water and sewer system underneath. So making sure that that is not going to be the case. We don't want to give someone a home and then stick them with, a sewer replacement bill that, costs more than the house itself almost. The other thing, be careful about what we're requiring to put in as far as like the width of the root ball and things like that, because when that gets too large, you can have frequent need for sidewalk replacements, right? It can damage street corners, it can damage driveways. Also, we want to make sure that, it's not hanging over the house itself. right? You can get some more damage if you have wet leaves sitting on your roof or pine needles or things like that. So basically make sure that whatever we replace it with is not going to damage the home or the underlying infrastructure. Last thing I would say is I think it probably makes sense to create a safe harbor. I don't think that it's necessarily needed. I think the bill is clear on it, but it might be helpful to have a safe harbor that just says, hey, if a certified arborist tells you that the tree is unhealthy, you have to let them remove it. The reason I say that is that I actually had a neighbor growing up who had a tree that they determined was not healthy. The city didn't let them remove it, and within a year, there was a windstorm, and it took down the tree through their bedroom. Fortunately, they were in the living room at the time it fell. But an unhealthy tree not being allowed to be removed or having to do it at an exorbitant cost is a safety issue, legitimately. If it's not a housing issue, it is a safety issue. They are lucky to be alive. And it took them a long time to deal with the city on what to do with, the remainder of the stump and things like that. Keep this simple. We all want trees. I love trees. My tattoo here is a ponderous pine needle, right? But trees should not be getting in the way of the homes. We had a builder in Salem that had, I think, 40 lots. About 20 of them had trees on them that they would have had to remove to put homes there. They went to the city said no, the entire 40 lot project fell through. So this is not a small potatoes issue. There are real challenges that come in here. Yes, we all love trees. We all want to make sure that our neighborhoods are, safe from heat and things like that, which trees help with, right? Providing clean air. But the purpose of this rulemaking is getting homes built. And so let's keep the focus as narrow as possible.
Yeah, thanks, Brock. So I think clarify DLCD, you can slap me back if I'm out of school here. I mean, I think your first comment is where we're focusing, right? To not drift into the protected, not drifted into you're clearly allowed to remove, but really centering in on the specific statutory requirement that these type of trees need to be mitigated. So I think for a starting place, it's a good reminder for everybody that is the place that we want to have this conversation. Second piece, I'll just ask as maybe a follow-up question, because I appreciate all the things you named. What I heard you describing is what we should avoid, but are you saying like the rules should say something to the effect of that they must consider impacts on infrastructure versus consider the impacts? Like, I guess I'm trying to really extract like, what's the rule direction that you're providing versus what do we want to avoid? Does that make sense how I'm asking?
Yeah, so avoid requiring replacement or replanting in a situation where statute doesn't already require that.
Right.
And then when it does require it, right? So let's say we remove a tree that is a locally protected species, it's not unhealthy, and it's at least 12 inches at DBH. At that point, talk with the builder, right? And say, hey, like, give us a site plan, like show us where the sewer lines are, where the water lines are, things like that.
Okay.
And here's the list of trees, if we have one, that you can choose to replace it with, right? Once you have kind of the tree species and the age of the tree, right, you can do a little basic research just on those, and you'll be able to understand like what the root structure looks like, right? Does it have a deep taproot that might go into that sewer line?
Okay. Yep, that's great. Thank you. Ethan, did you want to? Yeah, please.
Yeah, thanks. And yeah, just affirming that the first point you make, Brock, just for everybody, to hear you say it and then also DLCD say it. That you've hit at the heart of the scope of this rulemaking, which is what is the mitigation, replanting, replacement requirements? What's that structure look like for just those? You'll have to help me with the citation, section 2(5)(e) big B, I think. That's the instance that we're talking about mitigation around today. And then to one of the items you said, I'd like to actually invite local governments. I see Jonathan and Eric and a couple other folks who are maybe eager to jump in about what kinds of things you need to like consider the placement of those replantings, those mitigating measures to ensure that things like infrastructure and the, you know, the laterals and all that kind of stuff aren't impacted by the placement of those trees. So curious of like what specific information or site plans or proposals or anything like that might you need to take a look at to review to ensure that those critical services are not being impacted as well.
That's great.
Just
Thanks.
invite.
Yep. And so I'll look, we have a good queue here, but I'll look to all of our local government folks to kind of reflect on what Ethan just asked. Jonathan, then Mary Kyle.
Hi, thank you, everyone. Going back to one of the things Brock said, I think it's very true. We need to keep it simple, especially as practitioners. It's hard to dance through a lot of things. It's confusing for the customer. It's confusing for us to try to implement at different times too. But I think one of the important things, and obviously Ethan and his team will make sure at the end of the day it meets this, but the standards that we help provide comments for need to be clear and objective. And that's one of the big issues that we're going to have is how do we create a mitigation step that's actually clear and objective. Something similar to how Department of Forestry has it. You remove a tree, you have to replace it with 3 trees, 4 trees, whatever their standard is. It's those types of elements that we're really going to need to be clear and objective on. I can't, from an implementation standpoint, enforce something that is subjective without going through a land use process in true reality. So how do we do that and keep it very defined if the intent of this is supposed to be, since we have Habitat on the call, Habitat is able to come in and say, I want to build this here. We need to have that as clear and objective as possible. I agree with Ethan in the concept of, we do need to, and we can, reach out to our public works departments and stuff like that to figure out what their ideal situation is for separation. Our engineering standards already have some of those for recommendations for what we should consider for proper separation from the sewer laterals, the city mains and stuff like that to help eliminate potential crossovers. I did definitely like Brock's suggestion of using a actual arborist or a forester's report. That makes it a lot cleaner and clearer for jurisdictions to deal with.
Good, thank you. Mary Kyle? Mary Kyle might be frozen. Oh, there you are.
Okay, thank you. I wanted to address 2 separate issues. One is first, just to ensure that whatever we develop here is not inconsistent with what's already in rules regarding the climate friendly and equitable communities, rules which have requirements related to tree canopy and trees in certain circumstances. I've read through those and I'm not sure how they might or might not integrate with these, but I'm just hoping that the staff is looking at that because those rules, and they don't apply to all cities, but they also are a good reminder that we're not just talking about housing units, we are talking about homes that people live in. And there are important considerations to take into account there. And then the second one, my second point is that perhaps it's because I live in the city of Portland and removed trees in our parkway there that were diseased and replanted them. But it seems like Portland, and I would assume most other cities, have extensive regulations regarding what kind of trees to replant with and how to choose the location and all of that. And I hesitate that the state should get into that because that just sounds duplicative and time consuming and inefficient. And in particular, what trees one should plant in one part of the state are not going to be the same as others. There are cities that have adopted wildfire resilient vegetation standards for all vegetation across the state, et cetera. So in terms of how to plant them related to infrastructure and the sewer interference and what types of trees are appropriate in different jurisdictions, I'm assuming most cities have that sort of thing already, and we don't have to duplicate that. So I'd want to keep whatever we're doing in this rulemaking pretty high level and not have like a parallel set of rules that conflict with what cities are already doing. Thanks.
Thanks, Mayor Kyle. Ethan?
Yeah, I think this is one of the, when I think about how to actually sit down and write these rules, that's one of the things that's really concerning to me. If like, how do you set a statewide standard for what it means to replant that is going to work in all of these different contexts. And so I'm curious, I guess this is another question to local governments. Could it be, I'm spitballing, could it work where the state just says replanting in the manner that the city might require? Is that advantageous? Are there
I would just like to
disadvantages
say
that?
too, for everyone, that's what I was talking about. I'm not talking about the state having to do extra work. I'm talking about just let us have some set of standards. I'm just trying to defend myself because I'm not trying to state we should add more work to the state. I know that cities and regions have these rules, and I know that ecologies are different across the state. I was just trying to state that we should have some kind of awareness of these standards. I'm just defending myself here.
Yeah, Shane, I don't know if that's, that's.
Yeah, I wasn't responding to what Shane had said at all. I heard it coming from local governments and others, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think
Keep going.
Your point is a good one, and I think at least I've grasped that. But yeah, I think that's one of the questions that I'll throw back to the group is should it just have a deference to the local government processes, or does that have disadvantages, pros, cons? Love to hear thoughts on that, but we can go to Kathy.
Yep, Kathy.
Yeah, so my point was actually to that standard, because I live on a coastal environment. What sometimes DLCD wants as a tree perhaps won't work in this environment, right? We have high coastal winds, just a different landscape and many reasons why a tree for a tree doesn't exactly work. So brush or other plantings might be a better standard. And I think if in this process, if the tree can't be safely relocated onto the project area, it's maybe best. One of the workarounds you mentioned in the pre-work materials was a fee in lieu of planting, where then the city could have the use of that funding and also the decision-making power to decide what's best to plant in that particular area, or maybe not in that area and somewhere else, and then to have those fees available to make those decisions. And so I didn't know at what point you were going to discuss those workarounds, but this seems like a good spot for one, to have the cities make the decision, and two, for the cities to have some kind of funding to be in order to make the decision on whether it should be trees or shrubs, for instance, because in some environments that's best.
Right. And yeah, I'll just key in on one of the points you made, Kathy, which is I would like us to think about this as a menu of options, menu of tools. And we're not saying you must replant with these specific things and you cannot entertain, a fee in lieu or something like that. I think it is you can do this, any of these things, you pick one. I think is like an approach that provides the most options on kind of all accounts.
Great. Let's go Eric, then Jill.
Yeah, thanks. First question, I think the most appropriate way, if it's possible, is to replant on the same lot. I think that's always ideal. I've tried to work through like what other options would be available. Like I think the some of the language in the law says on the neighboring property, it just gets difficult pretty quick. I mean, maybe in a public park or something like that, but then you got to have the city involved. I think as soon as it goes off that specific lot, it just gets pretty complicated pretty quick. And then I wonder about like how to ensure that tree, if it's not on that specific lot, is actually protected long term to try and meet, the canopy or the greenery or open space goal. So ideally on that lot, if it's possible. And then the second question, I think my only comment there is around safety. And I just envision a situation where, a city might place a condition of approval on a subdivision, for example, based on wind throw concern. That's a very real thing we deal with in the Northwest. Wind throw meaning if you remove certain trees that the trees next to it are then exposed to wind and could then fall, onto a property or something. And so local codes often have a requirement that before trees are removed, there's a arborist assessment of wind throw risk. And if that risk exists, then certain trees on certain lots might be required to be retained. And so then if the Oregon Home comes in and says, actually, these trees can be removed because this is an Oregon Home lot, the assessment would need to be done again for the trees that are then nearby, that then might be exposed to wind throw. So I think just somehow working in safety as an assessment of trees on surrounding properties or on that property once those trees are removed to accommodate the Oregon Home. And then not really directly addressing these questions, but I just kind of big picture process wise, I just go back to land use and conditions of approval. And I guess actually maybe my specific comment is if a condition of approval was placed on one of these lots where an Oregon Home is now going to go regarding trees and tree canopy, if that tree is going to be removed, somehow getting back whatever that condition of approval was addressing. So, for example, if it was wind throw and safety, like that's got to be addressed somehow. If it was minimum tree canopy requirement, then somehow replanting on that site to then get back up to the canopy requirement. So, for example, Sherwood has a 40% canopy requirement in subdivisions. So developer will come in and say, we're going to preserve these trees on these lots, and there's your 40% canopy at the end of the development. If now the Oregon Homes is going to come in and remove some of those trees, then somehow getting back to that 40% on other lots or on that lot or somewhere else would be the recommendation, is basically get back to the underlying code requirement if that condition of approval was intended to meet the code requirement. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Eric. Jill?
In general, I do feel like it makes sense for individual jurisdictions to dictate kind of the specifics, as people have said. I am agreeing with that, with a couple of exceptions. There are situations where you might have a site that has tons of trees, way outweighs what would be the requirement if it was to be newly developed. So if there's somehow a way to allow a property owner to remove, say they had 40 trees and they want to remove 5, do they really have to mitigate for those 5 when they have so much that are already there? So I guess somehow a way to review the specifics of the total number of trees on the site. And then the other thing is if you say there's a very large tree, and to sort of properly mitigate the cover, like the last speaker just said, you would need to plant 3 or 4 trees. It also depends on, well, what are the buildings being put in there? Because I've done projects where you have the required 5 foot by 5 foot area for a new tree, but it's way in the back, between buildings. I think we all know that's never really gonna grow. And so what is that really doing for us if the whole point is for the canopy? So those would just be the 2 things that I think could make building more likely to happen if they were considered.
Okay, thanks, Jill. Alexander, then Brock, then Fred, then Jonathan, then Morgan.
I think, there are so many complex factors, and I think a lot of it is probably going to be best suited to maintaining some level of local control, wherein what you are replanting obviously is going to probably be a decision best made by the local government, rather than having DLCD having to make some kind of god-awful spreadsheet of all of the different plants in Oregon. And so to some degree, you're going to have to maintain local control, especially for, Eric brought up wind shear elements and things like that, where having a local arborist involved is going to make a much bigger difference in terms of longevity than anything that the state or even really, the local government who are, the ones administering the tree code, but they're not generally experts in the trees. That's going to do a whole lot more for the actual longevity of those in the future. So I think, depending on your local government, you're going to have different approaches. Some of our local governments are going to like fee in lieu, and it's going to be suitable for their environment. It's not going to be suitable for other environments in our state. And so, it really varies. I think you've heard from folks representing different parts of the state today, but what folks need in terms of tree cover and vegetation and foliage is so variable. There's no one correct way for the state to set every single regulation. So the menu is very correct, and I think it is some kind of variation between required replacement with a list of species and fee in lieu. And then obviously, you're gonna need information from the builders about what replanting looks like.
Right, thanks, Alexandra. Where were we, Brock?
Oh, yeah, the one thing I was gonna say, I don't know that the CFAC tree codes necessarily apply here. Or not tree codes in CFAC, but the tree related provisions. Subsection 2 of section 2 provides that the whole thing is notwithstanding any comprehensive plan or land use regulations or statewide land use planning goals. I know that CFAC is not the goal, right? We're talking about Division 12 rules, but those are land use regulations. And it brings up an interesting question. If you have something in a CFA zone that is less than 20,000 square feet and more than 1,500, do those same minimum densities apply, for example? Right, because the CFAC is directing local governments to adopt a program. It's not saying, hey, here's everything that you need to do exactly, right? It's laying out the framework for what local governments have to adopt. I'm not an attorney, but I think it brings up a potentially unexplored legal question.
Yeah, so I'll maybe, Ethan, I see you jumping in, but maybe that's just an ask for DLCD is consistent with the previous conversation around making sure that we're capturing the overlay of potentially aligned or potentially competing statutes. So for climate friendly areas, I think DLCD, you all had to do some work to make sure you're reconciling where there could be conflict. Is that fair?
Absolutely. And I would also say in terms of looking for a place to go in terms of crafting standards, that might be a place to look for like best practices, for example, not necessarily that those would be adopted off the shelf or they're entirely applicable at all. I haven't done that research, but to your other point, Brock, it's a good question that I haven't had the time obviously to dive into, but I'll point you to section 2.4 sub D in 2258. And that might give you some breadcrumbs. Again, I haven't looked, but it does speak to minimum density. So we could both do some research on that.
Yeah, we're gonna be experts at subsections by the end of this conversation. Let's go Fred, Jonathan, Morgan, and then I think we're probably gonna have to move on from this conversation if there's nothing else urgent. So I'll look for maybe one or two more hands on top of the queue. Fred?
Perfect. Hey, so I guess my question is related to when exactly this is required. When I'm looking at the bill itself, it says that it needs 3 things, and I think it needs all 3 of those things. Is that correct, Ethan? So
Correct.
locally designated as a protected species. Can you explain to me what locally designated as a protected species is? Because we have some trees that we've designated in Independence, but we don't have a whole ton of them. Can you explain what that means? And potentially that removes a whole bunch of the need for mitigation in other communities.
Yeah, I think I don't think it's applicable necessarily in all jurisdictions because you're pointing on or touching on a point that I think is relevant for lots of cities in the state that they haven't done that designation, so to speak. So if there is no designation, then you're kind of looking at a list of 2 things probably in terms of whether to have required mitigation. But there's an example that I provided in the pre-recorded materials. I don't know if it's necessarily super answers your question, but there are the example I used is the city of Salem protects, has designated particular Oregon white oak trees as a protected, locally, not, I want to use the right terms, as a protected species locally. And those trees of certain sizes within that species are, require other kinds of mitigating or prohibitions on removal. So that's that specific, maybe not in terms of the regulatory framework, but that specific process of identifying a species and having some sort of additional or specific mitigation requirements associated with that particular species is, I think, what's being called out there in 2258.
And Fred, was your
Maybe
question
some
that
cities don't have that? Yeah.
That it is contingent on meeting all three of those things, right? So if it doesn't, any one is prohibitive.
It's exactly. So like for instance, I don't think that this would apply very often in Independence. So
okay, that's great. Let's go Jonathan, then Morgan.
So especially using Ethan's idea of kind of a menu of options plus allowing local stuff, I was thinking how we do our general landscaping requirements for singles and middle housing, and that style of approach may work in this type of situation. So like we don't get involved in single and middle housing too much for what type of trees and stuff they plant. We just literally say 1 6-foot tall tree and I think it's 4 1-gallon shrubs. So that style of method could be a neat way to do it. So we're kind of directing what we want to see and then allow that language in there that says, as a list maintained by the local jurisdiction for suitable plantings. And then that gives great opportunity for, like Shane's awesome suggestion of, at different times, a tree may not be the appropriate thing. It may be shrubs that's the better use for the space, better for the built environment. So that would leave that great opportunity. And then where jurisdictions like us for at least the middle housing, once we get into that multifamily element that this covers, little different, but it allows the developer or their landscaper to select things that's appropriate for the region where we don't have lists.
Great. Thanks, Jonathan. Let's go Morgan, and then I'm going to have to move us on, I think.
All great comments. I love the discussion. I think you've heard some really good input, Ethan. I think just another idea to add to the mitigation list, and maybe there's a little pie in the sky, but maybe there's some extra weight given to mitigation replanting that happens as a street tree, just because those often remain in the care and control of the city. So there's a little bit more long-term longevity around those trees, but just an idea, not to replace the others. And I think in the conversation we haven't touched on, when we talk about removal, we often think about cutting a tree at the base, but when you remove half the root system, you're basically killing the tree. So I think part of this rulemaking should contemplate what protection requirements go along with that. Maybe that's also deferred to the local jurisdictions, but I think that's an important part of what constitutes removal. Thanks.
Interesting last tidbit there. I wanted to ask a question on, right, so you're saying like you get extra mitigation bonus, if it's a street tree as opposed to planted on the site.
Yeah, they're weighted more heavily to kind of like how you do the parking in the model code.
Right. Okay, thanks. All right, Ben.
Yeah, well, let's move to the next conversation, Ethan. I'm just going to throw it right back to you. And just, spend a little extra time on that space. So I'm going to ask that we at least start this conversation, because it is focused on local review, that I'm going to invite our local government, our builders to begin the conversation, and I'll open it up more broadly, but just want to make sure we hear from some of those specific perspectives first. But Ethan, why don't you give a little context, and then we'll jump into the discussion.
All right, so still talking about Oregon Homes here, and this is what does that review process look like for local government folks, particularly when it comes to the review for compliance check with the development standards term that we've worked with quite a bit development standards that will be crafted under the Oregon Homes program. So like let's just kind of run through the scenario that we're keying in on here. Builder takes Oregon Home plan to the city, or the local government says, hey, review my application. I'd like to build this home under the Oregon Homes program. That local government planner official does what with it? That is literally the question that we're talking about today. What are the standards? What is the process? What are the steps that they're taking to review and ensure compliance to approve or deny that application for the development of an Oregon home? So when we talk about residential development, and I put this in the presentation, there are different levels by which local governments review those kind of development applications. When it comes to residential, though, those are highly limited in terms of what types of review processes a local government might apply to those. And so really, I wanted to start the conversation from the point that we're looking at what's called a ministerial review. We're keeping that review as administrative as possible, and not dipping into the other kinds of reviews that require more subjective decision-making processes. So clear and objective standards is what we're looking at. We're looking at a ministerial review, really what amounts to probably a compliance check. And I think we can talk about what that means more realistically, but then also what are the other instances where we'll call it and this is maybe not the right term, but a deeper review might be necessary. So we talked about tree removal. In the instances where there's a tree that's proposed to be removed, there's going to be some other review process, like literal steps and checklist review steps that the local government is going to go through. Same thing with variance requests, adjustment requests to standards. That might be another instance, but if there are other ones, I'd be curious to hear. So that's my cue up for the discussion. What does that review actually look like? Final point I'll make is that there are two review processes that local governments often do that are not within the scope of this rulemaking. And those are public facilities review, that review process that a local government applies for public facilities. Local government can establish that for Oregon homes. They can use the same or different or whatever they so choose on the public facilities review, and for traffic impact analyses. Those reviews are not part of what we'll be talking about today. It's literally just the land use and zoning kind of compliance check. Well, that's my cue up for our discussion here, Ben.
Great. So Ariel, we can bring the questions up just to remind folks. So maybe just starting with our inviting our local government folks in for this first question, and then I think really asking also our developers and builders in the room to jump in as well. Yeah, Jonathan.
I'm happy to start. We actually do offer a master review program, so I can kind of share how we do it, because it does help streamline the process. So like for us, when we have a master plan that's been developed by one of, say, a production builder or just a normal builder that wants to use their plan again, really when we come in for our review, really for our system, because we keep the masters, they basically are just providing us a site plan. So when we go through that review, yes, we do the other review for building, we do the review for public works, but from a land use perspective, we are looking at it from those gray area design standards that we've been debating. Does it have enough glazing fitting the street facing? Is it now a corner lot? Does it still work? Those sorts of elements. Does it have that front porch or a front door facing the street? Those elements for our quote unquote design standards. And then does it meet the setbacks from both perspectives? Obviously the building code side and then the land use side. And then we also look at other design elements out of the development side, is the driveway approach, meeting our minimums and our maximums, when we used to have parking, does it be parking, those sorts of things. So we look at it only strictly from that one perspective. And for the most part, as long as everything works, it's a 10-20 minute review really from our planners to make sure that it meets the right criteria for our development code.
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. Yeah, Ethan.
That kind of, I'm curious if that kind of matches other local government processes, because I think, Jonathan, that seems like what you're describing seems like what is being or what the goal for Oregon Homes is, where it's truly an assessment. Somebody takes a look, looks at the site plan. Okay, is it set back far enough from the side lot? Does it have, if it has parking, is the driveway big enough? All those kinds of things. And they're doing this, running through this checklist of sorts. Does that map out in other jurisdictions too? Thumbs up from Morgan.
Thumbs up. Cheryl?
Yeah, similar. County's a little bit bigger. We got a lot more stuff going on, and we have a lot of things, moving parts. We do our residential ministerial as part of the building permit. So planning reviews it for those things as it's routed as part of the building permit. So it's a pretty easy review for the building. I do want to say, in this Oregon Homes, that clarity where that became important for us is like, things that we think of in the middle housing, like single family, like single structure, attached, detached, duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes, cottage clusters, those all fit in that ministerial really building permit. When we get to more than 6 units, and we're talking up to 12, we do have a few more design standards we're looking at, because it is pushing into that like multifamily housing and gets a little more complicated. So I think that is something to consider when we're talking about the type of review. I guess a point of clarification, if I'm reading the bill, and I'm not a lawyer, if I'm reading the legislation correctly, it says the commission may specify for these types of developments a process that the local government may apply. We have some pretty strict requirements on us already for getting these done as fast as possible. And so is it even worth writing additional things when we're trying to juggle so many things like the middle housing requirements and clear and objective? I think a lot of us are already doing about everything we can to get housing out as fast as possible. Believe me, we want the housing to come in and get out as quick as we can. We track those metrics all the time.
Thanks, Cheryl. Ethan?
I think it's, I think the general approach, and I'll speak, just from how DLC is probably like what path we're heading down, is thinking through the types of reviews that a local government should not apply to Oregon Homes, like putting setting up a framework, some bumpers around what levels of review and processes are not relevant for Oregon Homes. That's really, and not to create a entirely new review process for Oregon Homes.
I appreciate that clarity. That makes a lot more sense. Yeah, because I know it is already very prescriptive and prescribed of how fast we're doing this. Thanks for that clarification.
Fred?
Yeah, so what I was going to say is we do like our single family homes and duplexes as ministerial as part of the building permit. Like Cheryl said, it's when it gets a little more than that, like Cheryl was saying too, that we do we call them site design reviews here, but it's like a type 2 permit. So there's a notice that goes out to neighbors. We don't have a public hearing for it, but there is a slightly higher level of review for those projects.
Yeah, thanks, Fred. Actually, City of Independence was the code that one of the codes that actually looked at to prep for that presentation. Also looked at the City of Bend. They have I'm gonna butcher the name of it, but it sounds very similar to what Jonathan you're sharing. I think it's minimum development standard review or something like that, which sounds like I said, sounds very similar to what Jonathan and maybe Morgan you're working with too.
Right. Thank you. So I guess for the developers, builders in the room, what's coming up for you in terms of your experience, Jill?
Yeah, just on that last piece that Fred brought up, I'm wondering if there's a way that so from a developer point of view, design review is a bit of a big hurdle, even if it's like a site development review. I know different jurisdictions, that's maybe more like a ministerial review, and then some of them are more like a design review where you have to like write the thing that shows how you prove that your design meets the requirements. I'm wondering if there is a situation like someone has done a land use review, like maybe they've done a zone change. And then normally a zone change would require design review. I'm wondering if somebody's using an Oregon home, could somehow the design review part of the requirement be waived? Or if it's under 4 units. I have a 3-unit project that has to go through design review, which seems crazy to me. But it was because it was part of a zone change. So somehow maybe like if it was less than a certain number of units, it wouldn't have those requirements if it was an Oregon home.
Good. Thanks, Jill.
That one's churning in my brain, so I don't have a exact response for you right now.
Yeah, thanks, Jill. Eric?
Thank you. I think just very generally speaking, in terms of the level of review or instances where there might require a deeper review, the greater the size of the project and the greater the impact to the community would prompt, higher level of review. I think even if it's at a minimum notification to neighbors, that something's going to happen. And to me, it just goes back to goal 1 of even just the notification. I think helps people be informed about what's happening, even if they can't comment or appeal or anything like that. That's where a lot of the state legislation is going these days. We tend to get at the local level just a lot of frustration about being uninformed, also about not being able to comment or have a say, in what's happening. But at a minimum, that's why I like at a minimum the notification. And the benefit, just to give a specific benefit of why in Sherwood we like that. Let's say there's no appeal rights or public comment rights. It at least notifies the neighbors and the community of what's happening, informs them of sort of the process. And so even if they don't have any rights, it tells them why they don't have any. Hey, this is a state law. City, because cities are taking the brunt of a lot of state legislation right now, frankly. And it helps us, be very clear with the community about why this is happening, that, hey, cities actually don't have a lot of control in some cases because frankly, we are being preempted by state law to address what's seen as a state housing shortage. And I think what I've noticed is just information, just understanding, really, really helps. And the city planners, the local jurisdictions truly are on the front lines. And so just to, help that ongoing relationship and trust between the local government and the local city planners and the communities that they are working for is super important. And what I have seen happen over the last few years with the state preemption is that things all of a sudden just happen. And there's a lot of mistrust that happens between the local government and the residents. And I think everyone understands, like, there's not a lot of nuanced or comprehensive understanding of how government operates and what's happening. And so when stuff just happens without public notice or any rights, even if it's state mandated, it just lands straight on the planning department and the local elected officials. And Sherwood has a lot of concern about that. So just somehow trying to give at a minimum notification, or at least the greater the impact, the greater level of review to address any community concerns. And my one last comment of why I like the public notice is even if they can't comment and make any changes through land use, it still allows them to understand the code that might apply. And then they can go to their next city council meeting and say, hey, all these trees got removed, or this thing got built and it looks this way, or it's sited this way, or traffic's a problem. And that could then result in actual legislative changes that then get boiled down into clear and objective standards. So there's still value in having the community members informed, even if through the quasi-judicial sort of application stage, there's not much that they can do. Having them informed to then go talk to their legislators to change code is still super valuable and something that, we'd love to maintain in Sherwood. Thanks.
Eric, is there a threshold for, I mean, you talked about size and impact. Is there a threshold that, I mean, I get the sentiment of notification and public notice as kind of a value that has multiple kind of benefits, but is there a size or impact threshold that you would describe?
Thanks for asking. Every jurisdiction is different. I think what I'd recommend is following the local code for process based on unit size is typically how it goes. So in Sherwood, over 10 units is X type of review, over 50 units is X type of review. In Portland, it's going to be very different because the circumstances are different there. So it would just go back to the local review authority.
Okay. Ethan?
Thanks. And I would actually maybe like to ask the opposite question, which is, I'd like us to entertain a scenario where there is not a strata of reviews for a qualifying Oregon home and what that would mean, and entertain like the ins and outs of how that might work. Just as to put all of the options on the table.
Let's open up, Brock.
Yeah, if we want to send out a notice, that's fine. I don't know how much it helps to actually send that notice when they don't have any say. Like, yeah, there might be a few people caught off guard that there's a duplex going up where there wasn't previously a home, right? But are we priming them to be upset about it by noticing them? Right? Are we saying, hey, this is going in, we're telling you it's going in because we want you to know, but by the way, you have no say whatsoever in what happens here. I feel like that's going to frustrate people more than it's actually going to help alleviate concerns. Right? And if we're getting comments that like, hey, we don't like this and the state says we have to do it, that is a response you can give to those constituents, right? But I think that adds a layer of frustration in the process for the local community. We have specific criteria about what goes on these lots, right? That has been prescribed by the state. If someone doesn't like it, they can talk to their legislator the same way they can talk to their city council, right? But for this, right, it would obviously need that legislative change. I don't, if you want to notice, I think that's fine, but I genuinely wonder if that is going to make it harder at the local level. If it's, going to create more resistance than it reduces.
Well, I think for today's purposes, DLCD hearing kind of both sides of that coin. I mean, I think Eric, you did a good job of kind of laying out kind of from the Sherwood perspective, why public notice would be valuable. And Brock, I think you're offering a potential concern, right, of just adding frustration. And so, balancing the kind of community information with the kind of local political realities, the state local dynamic, all that's complex. But I think for today, right, DLCD, it's hearing kind of both of those. And as we kind of move into this process and actually try to put some rule language that might reflect this conversation, I think we'll have to revisit the very points that both of you just made. Ethan, did you want to add something? And then I'll go Morgan and then Cheryl.
Yeah, just want to say, heard both of those perspectives. I know that's a very present conversation in the housing policy space now. So heard important consideration as part of this rulemaking process. I'd like to steer us, because we haven't gotten to this part yet, about how would a city review, how does it look different for a city to review a tree removal situation or a variance? Like what additional information might a local government need from the builder to actually make those decisions and ensure those compliance. So I'm pivoting, trying to help us pivot into that conversation.
Good. Morgan, you may or may not go there, but the question is on the table regardless.
I will try to find a way. This may be one of the few times that Brock and I are in agreement. We had a process where we were sending out notice for middle housing land divisions that was irrespective of the development that was occurring. It was just about the land division itself, and that was generating a lot of heat and anger and frustration from the people that were receiving these notices that were then told it's about lot lines. It's not about the development. And frankly, there's nothing you can do about the development. I think in a situation in a world where we have local appeal processes, or there's a report, or there's some element of discretion being applied, those are cases where the public has a right to see our decision making. And if it's clear and objective, we may make a mistake, and those also should be challengeable. However, I think House Bill 4037 is kind of like putting some tight parameters on even our ability to notify and limiting who can appeal. So I tend to agree that what I'm hearing from our frontline staff is these notices are like poking the wasp nest, and there's no sort of satisfaction that we can offer people when they call. So I'm just offering that as a counterpoint. Jill mentioned design review. I think that's something that we should be thinking about, because if we have a design review process, it's likely going to say that these projects aren't going to meet the design requirements. And so that's just a born conflict. And so that needs to be addressed. And then for the pivot, kind of along the lines of this process for getting these homes through the review process quickly and ministerially, I think to the extent that we can create a set of adjustment standards that are like 1537, that are essentially clear and objective, you demonstrate you've got some kind of condition that impacts your ability to site these homes, make it clear and objective, don't put it through a land use review process. But I know others may disagree. So that's just my input.
All right, let's go Cheryl and Eric.
I guess I'll make it quick. I support everything Morgan just said. That was spot on. In the notice, and that's where I think maybe going back to the local jurisdiction, because what makes sense in City of Sherwood may very well be important to provide that notice. My experience in Clackamas County is similar to Morgan's. People get upset. Why'd you even send this to me if I can't make a comment? Scope and scale too. In a county, we have a lot of residential development. If we were the cost of mailing notices is very high. We try to absorb that internally so that we don't increase our application fees just for the mailings, but it's becoming cost prohibitive. So things to think about. And I agree, if we're going to look at like how we can stay out of complex land review, the more clear and objective it is in the apps, like, hey, you get a variance for a tree if it's this or that, that would be more helpful than trying to run it through a really complex process. Yeah, hopefully that helps.
Thanks, Eric.
Thanks, Cheryl and Morgan. I think it probably is just the nature of the jurisdiction and maybe the size and Sherwood's just so small. We're 20,000. We have very local electeds that are very close to the residents, and maybe a way forward, just a recommendation is to not preclude a local government from sending notice. So if it's not good in Portland, but it makes sense in Sherwood, to not restrict the government from actually doing so. And I think our concern about a lot of the preemption is that state laws used to kind of set a minimum. They used to say, at a minimum, you should send notice to property. You have to send notice to property owners within 100 feet. Where the state laws are going now is saying, actually, you cannot do any public notice. And so maybe a way forward on this one is to allow the local jurisdiction to decide whether, based on the local circumstances and the relationship between that jurisdiction and the residents, about what's best. And then to answer Ethan's question about not level of review, but like what's needed, like what we really need when it comes down to it is for the developers or the applicant to submit enough material for us to review the proposal against the law. I mean, that's the most basic. So like, completeness check of like, did you submit everything that is needed in order for us to evaluate this based on what we can actually review? That's the most fundamental thing that we would need in terms of process and submittal requirements. Thanks.
Yeah, that's
Absolutely.
great. And thanks for seeking some productive, constructive resolution to the previous kind of discussion, Brock.
Yeah, and just to clarify, I'm not saying we should prohibit local governments from sending those notices if they want to. I think that's fine for them to do. The one thing I would say in that case is that let's make sure that we're keeping some sideboards around that, right? You don't have to notice the entire city. Maybe just within that 100 feet.
Yeah, that's fair. And I think, Eric, what I heard you saying is just don't preclude it, because if it's important at a local level, it should be able to not be prohibited. And cities can make their own determinations around what that looks like. Jonathan?
I actually go where Eric went with the completeness aspect. So, we already do for our multifamily, it's just a type 1L that goes through the director. So we try to streamline that as best we can. But they have very different completeness review timeline criteria. So either that may be one significant hurdle in being able to combine those two to be a true ministerial review for multifamily, because for BCD I only have 3 days and I have to start doing the noticing. And while the rules are slightly different between 1 and 2 family and commercial, we just as a jurisdictions try to stay as similar as possible, because it's hard to start cherry picking. This project's this project's this. So, it may be a burden for the jurisdictions if you're taking what they are used to having 30 days and saying, cram this completeness review in 3 days.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. I guess, Ben, if I can ask one last question, just to follow up, Morgan, Cheryl, Eric, Jonathan, the review, that completeness check is, you do this in a sequential manner. You check for completeness, then you review against the standards, or are you doing that concurrently? There ultimately is the same thing, or would it function to be the latter, or must it be the former? I guess is my question.
Cheryl, Jonathan?
Yeah, we do the completeness check first because of the volume of work that comes in. We want to make sure that we got a complete application before we send it into review. We use permit technicians and planning staff to do that, so we can get it done pretty quickly. But it's not helpful. We see that it's less helpful for our customers to put them through completeness if we don't have everything we need, if we just have, we don't have a site plan and things like that.
Jonathan?
So ours is kind of twofold. So basically a glorified permit tech for planning. A planner 1 basically does the initial screening to make sure we have the basic information. And then we do the completeness review, which ends up being somewhat of a hybrid. So the actual review planner is the one that does the completeness review. And then if they notice big glaring issues, they bring it up in the completeness element. So that way they can make the fix at that point instead of getting into the review.
Got it. Morgan, I saw your hand.
Our process is pretty similar to those. I think we just don't distinguish the permit review as a completeness period. It's just a part of the permit intake process.
That's good. Yeah, Fred, I didn't mean to exclude you from that short list. Hope you didn't feel
I didn't feel excluded. Don't worry.
Awesome. The same checks out for independence too, ish.
Yeah, you bet. It's probably more like what Morgan's saying.
Okay. Cool. Thanks. All right, Ben.
So we're about at time, but I know we did focus on kind of local developers and builders. It's a relatively kind of connected conversation, but I did want to open it up if there was other thoughts or reflections based on conversation we had. Okay.
I guess, that was really focused on local government perspectives, but I mean, from like the builder's perspective, is that kind of what, is that matching your expectations in terms of talking about ministerial review, this kind of like checklist review approach? Is that sounding about right? Or are there specifics that are still questions or outstanding for folks on, oh my gosh, I always run into this thing and we didn't talk about that. Jill, you mentioned design review.
Jill?
Yeah, maybe it's a reiteration, but it seems like the level of development or the level of land use review or whatever seems like it should go with the number of units. Like if somebody is doing, it's middle housing, but say it's 50 units and that's a real kind of project, I would expect as a designer and a developer that there would be more review involved in that. If it's 4 units, if it's maybe even up to 8 units, I'm not sure. That's where I would want it to be simpler.
That's fair. So somewhat commensurate with the size and scale and scope. Okay. Any other thoughts from the developer perspective? Based on what you just heard or reflections?
Yeah, I think the biggest concern or the perspective I would hate to leave this part of the conversation with from a builder is like, oh yeah, we just had that big long conversation, but there's still this thing that we didn't talk about that's still going to be this hurdle, or we get tripped up all the time in this part of the process, and we didn't address that. So I just want to make sure that we've overturned those rocks.
Trying to carry the metaphor, no salamanders jumped out the other turned rock or whatever. Okay, I'm not seeing any hands. We're about at time for a break. We're a little behind, but we'll have, I think, enough time to get into the cottage cluster. So I don't know if folks have, let's take 10 minutes. We'll come back at 11:05. You can like spin yourself around because then we're going to re-arrive on a different topic. So we'll see you at 11:05. Welcome back. So we're going to move right into the next conversation on cottage clusters. So Ethan, why don't I pass it to you to introduce it?
All right. Thanks, Ben. Welcome back, everyone. All right. Like we've mentioned a couple times, here is your red flashing light. We are moving away from Oregon homes. The last conversations we've been having, we're moving into an entirely different regulatory framework related to House Bill 2138, which is the other portion of the More Homes acronym, the middle housing portion of that acronym. So we are, we are shifting. We are moving away from Oregon homes into middle housing at this point in time for the remainder of today's agenda. So why are we doing that? I think the conversation to queue up just needs a little bit more context. So I apologize for a little bit more verbose of a introduction here than in previous pieces, but House Bill 2138 does many things related to middle housing. And in the context of the conversation we're having today related to cottage clusters, the original piece of legislation that began this or the allowance of middle housing was House Bill 2001 from the 2019 legislative session. That is now at this point 5 years into that program. We've learned a lot about how middle housing has worked and how it doesn't in the state of Oregon. And one of those things is related to or one of those items that has been raised in the context of what could work better is the definition of cottage clusters. So why are we talking about that today here in April 2026 when that is originally that middle housing conversation as part of the phase 2 discussion of rulemaking? Well, in the bill, there are various deadlines for compliance for local governments by which they need to update their local development standards to conform with the provisions in House Bill 2138. The deadline by which local governments need to comply with the updated definition for cottage clusters is January 1st, 2028. That is also the same timeline on which, or same deadline, the same timeline on which the department is directed to adopt and draft rules related to the provisions in 2138. So herein lies a conflict where the adoption date or the adoption deadline for rules is the same date in which local governments need to comply with those rules. Obviously, that's untenable for local governments. So this portion of that rulemaking is brought into phase 1. So we can conclude that by August of this year to provide local governments as much time as we can to operate under that new definition and implement those provisions by the deadline established in statute. So that's why we're here today talking about why we're doing that major pivot. I'm also going to share a couple slides in terms of the actual context of what changed in the statute. So bear with me while I get that pulled up here. One of the things that was in the discussion, I hope everybody can see that. It's a little small. Let me make it a little bit bigger. This is a slide from the presentation that was provided in the packet. So hopefully it looks familiar. But the consideration in cottage clusters, the existing definition, or I guess prior to 2138, put a square footage limitation, a maximum, on the footprint of what it meant to be a cottage cluster. And also, it necessitated that those be in a detached configuration, those units be in a detached configuration, in part because it needed to meet this 900 square foot building footprint limitation. So they couldn't necessarily be attached and still meet that 900 square foot limitation. Obviously, this puts a limitation on the kind of creativity, the flexibility, the different development scenarios that a cottage cluster might be ripe for, but have been thereby kind of prohibited because of the definition. So 2138 section 1C changes that definition for cottage cluster to the bottom portion of that, which is a grouping of dwellings that are attached or detached, 4 units in any configuration, have a common courtyard, and that each have a small footprint or floor area. And so the subject of our rulemaking, as we're directed through 2138, is to provide some clarification, some bounds on that particular phrase, small footprint or floor area. And I think one of the, we can talk a little bit more about the reasons and, kind of the core values of or as I've called them in the presentation, the kind of parameters for updating that definition is really to allow this kind of diversity of development opportunities. So on the left, it shows kind of a typical cottage cluster development as we've seen in the state of Oregon, and that really, there are reasons why it's those are the most typical, but in part it's because of the definition, because those units have to be small in footprint, because they have to be detached, because they're around a common courtyard. And the development scenarios on the right are kind of what we're trying to get at with that updated definition. Allow those to be in an attached manner and a mix of attached, detached configurations, allow for a diversity of unit types, and allow for, or actually incentivize and encourage the conversion of existing structures that might be larger to use in development, in cottage cluster development. So that's really the kind of core policy rationale. There might be other folks in this room who have other insights they would like to share about the manner in which those provisions in 2138 shaped up in the final pieces of legislation. But that's kind of what we're here to, those are like the policy goals that we're trying to instill here in this updated definition. And so there are a couple things there that might necessitate, or I just wanted to kind of call out. I don't think we're talking necessarily about a numerical limitation on building footprint. We attempted that, and we're here now revising the definition to not go in that direction. But I think there might be some different ways to think about that are more relational to either the other units on the site or the site square footage to begin with, or relation to the common courtyard, something that is I guess, truly like a numerical limitation on the unit sizes. I think, I'll kind of queue up the discussion and considerations and put that in folks' minds as they're thinking about how to engage in this conversation. So lots of hands. Feel free to ask clarifying questions on what we're even doing. I don't quite understand the policy approach, or I have a suggestion. All of those are warranted at this time.
That's great. Thanks, Ethan. So, and we can flash some discussion questions just to contextualize that for you all. I think it's Brock, Shane, Jonathan, Alexandra.
Thank you. So looking at this, and if we're going to try to stay away from using the footprint size here, the only other definition that we have in statute that, crosswalks size and cottage cluster type, maybe ironically, is in 2258, where it's talking about the average per unit size of not more than 1,400 square feet. I think that is the standard we should have. If you have 4 units on a lot, and on average, those units have less than 1,400 square feet per unit on average of livable area, that fits. There might be times where having those larger units is more advantageous to make the project pencil. But if we say, hey, these are all going on one lot of land, right? We know that we're not allowed to have an average of more than 1,400 square feet. Just set that as the maximum bound. And I think we're good to go from there. Any more stringency around that is just adding extra hurdles that have to be hurdled, I guess. But the one thing I would say is that, and I'm not saying that all cottage clusters should be 1,400 square feet, right? I'm not saying all should be smaller than that. I'm not saying all should be larger. What I would say, though, is that let's say we have one that's 1,000 square feet, right? And one that is 1,800 square feet. On average, right, you're going to get 1,400 square feet. But what that also does is provides an opportunity for someone with maybe lower income to be able to purchase that lot at the same time that someone with a higher income could purchase the larger square footage unit on that lot, right? And that helps with socioeconomic integration. This kind of creates an opportunity for LCDC to enable the development of smaller condoized single-family homes in the form of cottage clusters. And if we can do that in a way that, allows the projects to get built and allows for better socioeconomic integration, I don't know why we wouldn't do it. So I would strongly recommend saying, as long as on average the per unit size is no more than 1,400 square feet, it's good to go.
And Brock, just really, I might have missed this. Where does the 1,400 come from?
That comes from 2258.
Okay, all right, that was the reference. All right,
Yes, it's the only statutory reference to size other than small area.
good, awesome, thank you. Shane?
I just want to say I love this conversation. I'm super happy about it. I'm coming from just a generalized, like, what's the vibe? What's the potential for parties? What's the potential for accessory commercial units and pollinator plant corridors? At the end of the day, the more diversity of unit sizes, unit types, unit variations, and the ways that lots have different purchases, the more diversity of airflow we have, sunlight, a potential for tree canopy. And then on a social level, I'll speak just for queer community for a moment. I know so many people in my life, even 45, 55, who are just entering their first years of their transition. And unfortunately, they just don't have any family. And when they come to the Northwest, they're shielded here, right? A trans person seeking a new place to establish roots can be in just as small of a pot as a new basil seedling, right? So that's the metaphor I'm saying, where it's like, if you do diverse unit sizes, for example, what if one of them was 700 square feet? What if one of the units was 500 square feet? Like, I know there might be more apportionments for utilities, obviously getting appliances, bathtubs. I understand that every time there's a new unit, there's additional cost to that. But especially if it ends up being in the realm of like, all I'm saying is, and then also with landscaping, again, sometimes it's better to have different placements of where the landscaping is going, simply just for a different vibe. And so pollinators can travel differently. So in so many ways, I'm just affirming, please let the builders build, let the builders innovate, and then let's figure out different ways that we can really prioritize and elevate not just the concerns of the landscape, but the concerns of marginalized people who may get lower rent prices and lower potential mortgage entry points because we have unit diversities and not every single new lot is a McMansion.
Great. Thank you, Shane. I thought I had a follow-up question, but I'll come back to it. Jonathan?
So one of the things from a implementation standpoint that we had, I guess, concerns with, thoughts on, is the average. I know we've used it in other places, but it is a challenge after construction. And I think that's something that should be weighed as we're doing it, because if we're saying for the life of that structure, the land use aspect of it, right, we're saying that we have to stick with the average size of the entire site, you start limiting the potential for people to do additions or conversions or those sorts of things. So it does make it so if you make that smaller house and that someone can afford when they first start getting into it, they can never expand that. Where if you did set a minimum maximum type approach, at least that way people can grow in the home that they built. They can expand with their family. They can, downsize. They can do whatever they want to within that same shell. Because unfortunately, when we do the average, now all of a sudden, if we had a 12 unit cottage cluster and I want to add a 200 square foot addition, I'm now looking at how it all played out and saying, sorry, you can only do 150, and now no one else can add anything or whatever the scenario, because your average is over that 1,400. So it starts adding some challenges to that. So that might be something you want to take a consideration of. If it's average at time of construction or whatever. We know a lot of these are going to end up being CLT'd or condoed or middle housing subdivisions at some point in time. So they're going to be real property, not rentals in a lot of cases.
So Jonathan, a couple things. So one, I think you got to the second piece in your last comment around at time of construction might be one way to mitigate, right, this challenge that you're describing. I guess, did you have ideas around minimum, maximum?
Not really, because I think it's really up to market to see what's there. You know, our cottage clusters that we're having here, we have some that are, you know, just under 400 square feet, and that fits their clientele. So it's a lot more challenging to say, us as the government know what that specific rationale, what they need is for that situation. Because like in this case, it was for, you know, people transitioning out of homelessness or houselessness. And for that circumstance, they wanted smaller houses. We didn't want to stand in their way, you know, granted for what they needed to do, they went through a CU, but still, you know, at the end of the day, is there a small size? The building code already addresses what the smallest size you can have for a livable space.
Yeah.
So it may be more the maximum.
Okay, that's helpful. I think you were getting to after Brock and Shane, your comments around like, will the builders build? And I think you kind of answered that question, right? Like if the benefits of having this type of flexibility and different types of unit sizes, scale, will that actually happen? And I think you're using a good example of where it could. Jerica and then Kathy. Jerica, you're on mute. Trying to read your lips, but I'm not good at it. So.
Is that Jonathan, me? Shane, and Brock. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. What they said, just as an individual and a new homeowner, and now have sat in two different kind of individual homeowner discussions over the last year. One of the big things is I think is as people are moving into homes, people are looking as Shane noted is like, yes, let's have a multitude of units in an area to create that community and that space. And what Brock said too of that social economic. My big push would be that we do have varying sizes on lots. We have people that have families that maybe need a 2-3 bedroom, but we also have people that are totally cool with a single bedroom lot. I think Jonathan brings up some really good logistics behind those numbers. And I think there is something to be said of maybe there is a maximum less than a minimum in that way. And I would also just suggest that we work towards the intent around this rulemaking. Of the intention, I think for me personally would be that we look towards a detachment, particularly as somebody who just moved into a home. My biggest thing I wanted out of a home is actually doing the thing in the yard, having an opportunity to invite people into our yard, being able to do projects, adding a shed. For us, it's going to be a greenhouse. And there is minimums, right? Like I can't build anything over 200 square feet in our yard without a permit and things like that. And so I just want to emphasize as an individual advocate here is to really look at the potential of detachment and attachment spaces. And then to Jonathan's point, I really do think that there should be something to be said around the idea of like, well, if one person decides to put a shed on their lot part of the property, does that affect somebody else's ability at also placing a shed, et cetera, or another unit? Because I do think it's really important for us to consider, as Jonathan also noted, again, just seconding you, Jonathan, great ideas, is growing in our homes and making sure that it's not feeling like a family continuously has to move out to another space because they're growing their family. Even the homes in Oregon right now, I live in 1,000 square foot home. It's 2 bedrooms. It is truly our second bedroom is the tiniest room of all time. My wife and I have talked, if we were to have a baby, this house we'd have to eventually move out of because the room is not sufficient enough for an adult or teen in that way. And so even thinking about our own families moving in with us, if they want to age, here in Portland, our home would also not be conducive to that. So just thinking out loud a little bit around, again, the diversity of home units for a multitude of different families and different backgrounds of people experiencing what their needs are. Thanks.
And then let's go to Kathy, and I'll just ask this just maybe broadly, just as you continue to have this conversation. Am I hearing requiring multiple kind of unit sizes, incentivizing, or just allowing the market to decide. And so, I'm hearing the benefits of that, but I think that might be another overlay of the conversation. Kathy?
Yeah, I've got a couple of things, but just to add to what Jerica mentioned, I was going to mention a multi-generational housing as the trend that needs to go into the future. So wanting to ask the question, does this accommodate for that? Secondly, these are questions for the developers maybe and the rule makers in the room. Secondly, if they are attached, we're triggering fair housing when we go from 3 to 4 units. So that's a question to be addressed. And then also with the attached units, and I'm just thinking of the samples that you gave, the imagery of how a lot can be used. If they're attached, then we have additional fire codes that put in requirements there. And then again, what I mentioned earlier, ADA requirements to be thought about when we're thinking about minimum maximums. And then on the lot size where you have like a bigger home, a medium-sized home, and 2 smaller homes, the issue there is perhaps, let's say there is an existing home, do they still retain their right to have an ADA, which has also been part of this discussion in the past? And so what could be added on into the future, especially when we're dealing with an existing homeowner, right? And possibly encumbering on somebody that's already there. And then building into the future, some of the questions were brought up already about sheds and yards. We have a generation of people that are not having children, but pets. And Oregon doesn't seem to be very friendly to that home owner group because they feel like you should be able to walk your pet any time of day. But for the working folks, we need a yard for our pets. We don't have all day to walk our dog every 2 hours. So that needs to be accounted for in future home building. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Kathy. Jill, Jerry, Eric, Jim.
Yeah, I definitely agree with everyone on the value of providing this flexibility. And I could talk all day about like the reasons why we need to have these different sizes, but it sounds like what y'all are really asking for is how do we figure out what the measurement is going to be? And I will tell you, for any kind of middle housing, it's the lot coverage requirement that usually kind of dictates what's like, that's the, I don't know how to say it. Like, that's the one thing that then dictates what things are going to be. And so I liked cottage clusters because you don't have a lot coverage, like a total lot coverage requirement. However, I'm starting to feel like maybe the solution is more about what is the total footprint of buildings on the site instead of the individual footprint. And maybe that would get you to allowing this flexibility. So the issue is, though, if you say, well, leave it to the jurisdictions for whatever the zone requires for coverage, that I feel like is too small of an area, at least in the city of Portland, to be able to do the kinds of things you can do with a cottage cluster. So I think, so sorry, Morgan, but I think it maybe would have to be a different number than what for the zone, like that it would be product specific, like cottage cluster specific. So you potentially could do an average footprint or a lot coverage. But it would be really important, in my opinion, and also based on what other people are saying, is the whole value of a cottage cluster in my mind is that you get ground space that otherwise why wouldn't you just live in an apartment? And so we have to make sure that we're leaving enough uncovered area so that people can have even just the smallest private or semi-private outdoor space.
Yeah, thanks, Jill. Jerry?
I agree with Jill's comments. Also want to offer maybe a slightly different perspective. To me, anything over 1,400 square feet is not going to be, quote, small footprint or floor area. And I think cottage clusters are a unique kind of development. They may not be for everybody. And I think everybody should be welcome, but I understand the idea of you ought to be able to expand a little bit if your family is growing. And I'd like to accommodate that, but a cottage cluster is kind of a special kind of development, and I don't think it will work to serve everybody's needs. So it's a tough balance there to me. But 14 more than 1,400 square feet, that does not sound like a cottage to me. And I love the cottage clusters I've seen. I think they work really well, but they tend to be very modest. And that's part of it. It's a good situation for people who don't need a full house like you would build in traditional middle housing. So how do you balance those different considerations? I guess that's my question.
I think that's DLCD's question too. Jerry, Ethan, jump in real quick.
Yeah, if I could, I think, I wanted to ask a question because I actually don't think I took the right notes on Brock, your suggestion of 1,400 square feet. Is that unit size or is that building footprint? I think you said unit size.
Based on what you had initially said about trying to avoid referencing the footprint, that was more the unit size that aligns with what's in 2258. Just quickly while I have the mic, I would just say, Jerry, I agree, right? We want to make sure that we are providing, smaller opportunities for people who that is their preference or that's their need, right? But if we cap it at too small of a size, let's say we did 900 square feet, right? And you can fit 4 of them on this lot. What if that doesn't pencil? But if you replace one of those 900 square foot units with a 1,600 square foot unit, suddenly the whole project pencils. If it doesn't pencil with 4 900 square foot units, you get 0 units out of it. If it does pencil with 3 900 square foot units and 1 larger unit, the project goes forward and now we have 3 smaller homes that people can move into. So I'm not saying that all of them need to be 1,400 square feet, right? I'm just saying allow the flexibility to make the project work. That's going to get us more opportunities.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think, Jerry, I get to, your comments notwithstanding, right? Like that there's some threshold where you get to a place where it's not a cottage anymore, which I think that's, again, part of that balance. Ethan, did you have a follow-up or just that answer?
Yeah. Well, I think, to both of those points, I think it's like, what's the metric to set it at? I think, Brock, you've offered that, well, we already use that 1,400 square feet metric in other places. It also, for what it's worth, it's also the average that we speak to in townhouses in middle housing as well. It's a metric that's also shows up there. So there's some precedent, some paper trail of why 1,400. But Jerry, to your point though, is that the right number? Should it be a different number? And that's what this is going to be part of that conversation.
Yeah. Eric and then Jim.
Thanks. When the cottage cluster concept, first came online, I think a lot of people understood it. I still understand it in some ways as this of being accessible to those wanting to age in place. So, heavy influence on first floor access, ADA as well. And I guess I have a slight concern that as we redefine this, we might lose that element of it, especially as we're talking about two and 3 stories. So, and I guess it's like, at what point does it just need to be called a multifamily development or a townhouse development? So I think more flexibility is probably good, and I appreciate, I think it's Brock's comments, I think a little bit more flexibility in order to get this thing to pencil and to actually work is great, and I think that's definitely needed. We don't want to regulate to the point that we don't get any of these, but I think we have other housing types that get the unit count that we're looking for. And I just want to make sure that we don't lose focus of the sort of intent of cottage clusters of being frankly small, but also being first floor focused for accessibility for different types. Thanks.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Jim?
Thank you. A long list. I will speak quickly, clearly, I hope. All of this with a mindset of efficiencies and affordability, both in the construction cost and for a potential future homeowner. What studies and or reviews of studies of existing cottage cluster or villages has been completed, and what were the takeaways? This is not a new idea. It's been done successfully internationally for hundreds of years. And what can we learn from the work, and then how can we put the Oregon flair to that process? With regards to square footage, a percentage of porch and deck for consideration as livable space. So I think defining interior and exterior elements there, and I would advocate for kind of a minimum and maximum of that exterior porch and or decking. I would also advocate for fire hardening of any unit going into a cottage cluster situation. The closer we are, the more hazards that exist. Coupling that with defensible space, and I and my team like to move away from hardscaping. Hardscaping is not necessarily attractive in a community building sense. We can create firewise space that is rich and luscious in an ecological sense, and also helps with that defending of a home in the event of fire or storm damage. I agree with the accessibility aspect in terms of whether it's cluster parking or parking at the home, visitability, walk-up issues, and load-in issues for folks. Where's the discussion and what is the determination on permanent foundation? Our team just completed a 12-unit cottage cluster. However, it's a tiny home profile, so these are still remain on chassis. And to achieve efficiencies and affordabilities, might tiny homes permanently affixed to a foundation fall into this category? Where and how do we approach conversation with modular and panelized units, since we as a state have spent $20 million in the last 3 years to increase capacity at multiple modular and panelized industry partners? And where can they fit into this conversation to bring price down and increase production? And a conversation potentially about land use when it comes to that post-disaster response, because we've seen and we will continue to see 3 to 7 or 8 years to rehouse some persons post-disaster, whether they are coming from a renter or an ownership position, and a cluster approach can quickly rehouse folks in that disaster crisis. However, when you get to those zones that are on a septic, now we need to talk about a community septic situation, which, if designed properly, becomes the world's greatest dog park, because you have a green space environment and a potentially an orchard and tree space environment that you can include in the conversation. So thank you for allowing me a couple extra minutes there.
Yeah, appreciate all that, Jim. Thank you. Morgan, then Mary Kyle, then Shane.
Great points, Jim. I really appreciate that. I think there's another conversation around rulemaking around prefab housing that's not part of the scope, but I agree that there needs to be some attention spent there. I just wanted to just reemphasize that one of the purposes, one of our priorities that we're trying to achieve with this definition in the statute is that we are regulating cottage clusters for the purpose of incentivizing the provision of small, less expensive housing. So I think that needs to be sort of a paramount objective. I don't know where that number is, and I think that there is some legislative history around 1,400 square feet, which we've been using as an average size for our cottage clusters, and it seems to work. I think that some of the issues that Jill has experienced, and it is a bit of a limitation for providing ground level bedroom units or more accessible units, is the building coverage. That 900 square foot limit is pretty constricted. So I think we're open to a little more flexibility there. I've just put on the table as an idea since we are allowing these units to be combined together, maybe the building footprint just expands by the number of units that are in the same structure. So 3,600 square foot footprint for 4 units in a building, and how those are arranged, if they're all ground level 2-story, or if they're stacked on top of each other, or some combination thereof, maybe that's the metric. So just adding that to your list of things to think about. Thanks.
Yeah,
That's a good point. And yeah, it's probably it would probably tier by or multiply by the number of units attached. But yeah, that's just from the hip.
Yep. Thanks, Mary Kyle.
Thank you. Jim and Morgan said what I was thinking of and even more, so that was great. I will just say I support what they've been talking about. Also, at some point, if it seems like if we get above a certain square footage, 1,400 might be that number on average, we're really getting into duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, the different housing types that can now be attached or detached. And cottage clusters are supposed to be a specific type of development, as Morgan said, that are smaller, aimed at a more moderate or lower income. And also I can recall when we were first doing this with the middle housing legislation, some builders and I think it was actually realtors stating that this particular type of housing, one of the more primary categories of people who are interested in this were single women of all ages, because it's such a safe living environment, as well as people with mobility issues. So there's really a value here, and also in that courtyard. And I think that really makes these kinds of developments unique and special, and they're not trying to be for everyone any more than any other kind of development is supposed to be for everyone. So I'd like to retain that, but also recognizing that one should be able to retain an existing home that's already on the property if you want to use that. And I think that's accounted for here. But anyway, it's not just cottage clusters or an apartment building. We have all these plexes that you can do that don't have a courtyard requirement, or they can be stacked, whatever. So cottage clusters, I think, are a unique category that should be encouraged at an appropriate size. That I don't have a magic number for either, but Morgan and Brock seem to be in the vicinity of it.
You preempted my question. I was going to follow up, Mary Kyle. Appreciate that, Shane. And then Jonathan.
And now I get to say it again. I love this conversation, and I am grateful for everyone. I'm going to pepper a few people, but I am so glad, Mary Kyle, you spoke before me. I was going to go into this big realm, this like, what castles can we build in the sky? And I'm like, no, let's not make every tool be for every purpose and every population, right? And thank you for the other comments. So when Jerry was stating this isn't for everyone, I view it the same way as bus rapid transit. We know that to go from auto dependency to a realm that is not auto dependent, there will be a transitory period, pun intended. So bus rapid transit, not everyone is going to take it, right? But every single person that does take the bus rapid transit, that does want to take it, is one less vehicle on the road. What does that mean? Every single person that's off the road means less traffic overall. The same way where I know countless family and friends, queer and non-queer, where they don't want a 3,500 square foot home. It's too much maintenance. Their family isn't large enough. So I'm really going back to then Jerica and Kathy's comments, as well as Brock's, when it's like the unit variety, the family generational structures, and the price point. So let me go back. Then when it comes to the prefab conversation, I think there are some ways that the best metaphor I can give to make this simple is when I've been looking at my beds and doing my Hugel culture, I'm like, oh, I'm going to use this bed for this. And then I realized, oh, I have other projects to do, but all the soil or the space that I left for that thing, it can still be a thing at some point. It can still change at some point. And the soil was working anyway. So I just take it from there. So I guess in this conversation, I really want to actually agree with and affirm Mary Kyle's position. A cottage cluster is a specific variation. It is a specific form, and it's a specific aesthetic. And I think all those can meet together in some prefab, interesting ways. And also on the topic of accessibility, because I so believe that. I love the cottage courtyards and buildings. where there's a street level unit and then there's a set of stairs to go to an elevated courtyard, especially when there's like garages that are on the main street level that I've heard people have converted older style garages to, ADUs, right? So I think looking at the street level and seeing how we can do gentle density and gentle elevations can actually meet multiple accessibility points, as well as create really beautiful views. But by utilizing prefabricated structures and other things, the beauty and the form is going to be in the lot and how much care it was to design the entire space to begin with. I don't need marble foundations to make a beautiful life. Just give me a solid place and hopefully a clawfoot tub. I want it so bad.
Well, yes, thank you, Shane. We'll capture that for the record too. Jonathan and then Cheryl.
So BCD just recently finishing up the ORSC for the coming year, and they actually tackled the small houses thing. So not saying we should go with theirs or putting any emphasis on what size we should go with, but they did land on 1,500 square feet for considering that a smaller size home. So at least that 1,400 would align with what the building code is going to say to have a reduced need for energy and some savings. That's where they decided for trying to do some cost savings. So just wanted to point that out. We've had a couple discussions about modulars and stuff like that. So I just want to clarify, pretty much all modulars are available for any of these types of housings because that's regulated under the building code. They just have to go through the state's fabricated program. So either we can have manufactured homes that follow HUD standards, we can have prefabricated things that any of the factories decide to go through the state's program and do. The one that's challenging is the tiny houses on wheels concept, because those are actually classified as an RV in Oregon. So those ones are harder to try to convert over. But if they are manufactured at a local facility that follows BCD's prefabricated program and basically surrenders their title, yeah, we can look at them as normal housing. So those opportunities are out there already. It's nothing that needs to be recreated. When we're talking about lot coverage, I think one of the big things to also keep in mind when it comes to cottage clusters, a lot of the slightly bigger jurisdictions, not even super big at this point in life, follow under the MS4 programs nowadays. So a lot of that's going to also impact the need for on-site stormwater detention and water quality elements. So that could impact the allowable space, how they'd have to design stuff. So do keep that in mind. And then I know someone mentioned fire hardening. Do want to sadly remind that that's out of the scope of what we can talk about here. That's in the building code and what local jurisdictions are allowed to adopt independently under the building code. So just FYI.
Okay, thank you, Jonathan. Cheryl.
It's a great discussion. I really appreciate it. And Jonathan, those were a lot of clarifications that were excellent. Thank you for adding those. I just, on the jurisdictional side, this is a really great conversation, really support the different types. I think, in Clackamas County, we love to see lots of different types of housing coming online. Just want to throw out there, though, the more simple it is for us to determine whatever the regulation is, the easier it's going to be for us to get it through the review process. So just making sure, Ethan, I know this is top of your mind as DLCD, making sure it's something that's easy to understand that we could easily calculate, because on the jurisdictional side, we have to be able to validate that as part of the permitting process. And I, just to make sure we don't cross in too far to the middle housing requirements, and we have the regulations kind of stack up on each other, we're not sure which path it goes into. That gets confusing for the designers and us, and then we lose time while we're trying to figure out if we're in middle housing or not. And so just something to think about.
Yeah, thanks, Cheryl. Ethan, do you want to jump in on that point?
Yeah, I think I've been thinking about this, and I think it does make sense to, Cheryl, to your point, use average unit size, unit square footage, as opposed to square footage of the building footprint, because I think there's just a whole bunch of questions about like what's in the footprint, how do you calculate that? And a unit size calculation is much more clear, to your point, and it considers, I think, a little bit more concretely the variation in units that might be able to be cited on a particular lot. So yeah, that's helping inform some of that initial reaction that that I've been having.
Right, thanks, Ethan. Jill?
This was just a quick response to something that somebody else said. I think the reason why we might consider the value of attached cottages is because I believe in most single family zones, it's not like you could have two duplexes. They would have to be all one building like a townhouse. So whether that being allowed to have maybe two detached duplexes is in the cottage cluster code, or maybe it is in the model code. I don't, that'd be for you guys to decide, but just wanted to make that point about the value of that.
Yeah, thanks, Jill. Fred?
I'm just going to throw in garages because people haven't talked about garages a whole lot. And I mean, if we're talking about scale and small scale of housing, if we're talking about a 1,500 square foot house, and then we're adding potentially 200-foot garage on top of it, that's just a large house for a cottage cluster. So, I tend to agree that the smaller the scale, the better. For defining cottage clusters. I mean, I got my start as a planner on Whidbey Island, which is where Ross Chapin, the guy who wrote the Pocket Neighborhoods book, was, and all of his cottages were small. They were tiny. We're talking like 800, 900 square feet houses. So I think, yeah, that makes sense when we're talking about cottage clusters to me. So.
Fred, is there such a thing as I mean, does that connect to a 900 square foot with a garage? Is it the same?
Well, I mean, Ross Chapin would never, he never design, I mean, he wouldn't design,
Okay.
he did shared parking in his developments. And so having a garage is, I don't know, it's just a different sort of typology, it seems to me.
And Fred, I apologize. Can you say the name of this person again?
His name is Ross Chapin.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Ethan?
Yeah, I think there are some considerations of garage and how that factors into the footprint or the calculations of unit size in existing administrative rules. And if that finds a place here, it probably does, because if we're describing like floor area, unit size, then we need to determine whether or not the garage is part of that. But there is some precedent to basically exempt a portion of a garage. I think it's 200 square feet, or maybe it's 250. I honestly can't remember. It's been so long. But that is an approach that we could certainly take in this as well, if it becomes relevant.
Fred, is that a new hand or an old hand?
It's an old one. Thank you.
All right, just permanently leaving it up just in case. I'm not seeing any hands, but I'd just love to invite, I know we've heard from a lot of different folks in this conversation. I just really appreciate the way you all have both blended the kind of technical and kind of policy conversation with human lives and needs. In such a wonderful way during this conversation. I'd love to just, if I haven't heard from you, just want to just create a little bit of space to invite anybody else in, or any last thoughts before we start to move to closing. Okay. Well, thank you, DLCD. You got your work cut out for you, and maybe that's the beginning of the pivot to move to the next steps, because our next meetings will be jumping into some reflection back on all these conversations. So, Ethan, do you want to kind of talk about kind of where we are, where we're going?
Yeah, thanks, and thank you all for the discussion today. It's obviously very productive. Lots in there. I've got 4 pages of notes, so lots of reflections to do and work to do. So this kind of marks a transition phase of the rulemaking. We've completed the kind of like discussion portion of that, and being the sponge and hearing the thoughts and hearing the perspectives, and now it's our job to start putting those pieces together and forming the puzzle. So Our next meeting is April 29th, which will have some, not all, some draft rules ready for you to consider at that meeting. I also float the potential for a May meeting for folks, particularly May 20th. So I wanted to float that out there. And the reason being is the rules through the typical rulemaking process will go to the Secretary of State for what's called a notice of proposed rulemaking, which is like our final, here are the rules. Here are the rules that we're all going to be talking about as part of the public hearing. That gets published July 1st. And I think as we're considering, the time between now and July 1st, having only one opportunity to be with you all and discuss those rules doesn't seem like it quite is meeting the mark. So wanted to maybe thread in one meeting. It can be a shorter meeting in May, but that'll give us an opportunity to have yet another round of conversation discussion on some actual rule text with you all before it gets published on July 1st. So something to consider. We might go forward and just send a calendar appointment for that and it would be more optional because we didn't include that in the original set of meeting times when you all said yes to participate. So that'll be coming your way probably the calendar appointment coming to you in the post meeting follow-up. Just again, another opportunity for folks who have the availability, interest, all of that to meet with us and talk rules. But otherwise, we're moving into that rule drafting phase. So you'll be hearing from us on how those rules are shaping up. We might be reaching out to folks individually or in small groups to ask very specific, nuanced questions on, can you help us craft this actual language on this particular piece because you have direct experience in that kind of portion of the work. So that is my set of updates, and we're heading towards the path of notice of proposed rulemaking, public hearing in July, and adoption in August. So.
And then Ethan, I'll preemptively ask this question, and you can answer it to the best of your ability. When would you expect to get materials out to folks? I know we have some folks that represent constituencies and or other organizations. So do you have a sense of your deadline or maybe proposed deadline?
Right. We try to get materials out in a week in advance of the meetings, but I think that's the beauty of this kind of writing time is we have things that are available. We could send those out and do some sort of what's the word? Concurrent review over email, or just saying, hey, take a look at this draft. Here's some homework. We'll be talking about this at X meeting, or things like that. Does that kind of answer your question that you're asking?
Yeah, I mean, I think channeling just what we heard from folks right from the beginning is the earlier that they can get materials, the better they can prepare, communicate, do all the kind of political wrangling that comes with representing not just the individuals in the room. So I think that's a good commitment. Concurrent sounds wonderful and sounds like a good path. So with that, 11:58, much love, y'all. That was a great conversation. Thank you. We'll see you again at the end of April, and you'll be hearing from us in DLCD in the meantime. So appreciate you. Have a wonderful day. Enjoy the wonderful weather this weekend.
Thank you.